The man in grey decided to take the Glen suite of diamonds at midnight. Provided they were still in the apartment safe and the occupants away, this he needed to know. So he watched and he waited. At 7:30, he was rewarded. The big, wide limousine swooped up from the subterranean car park. It paused for an instant in the mouth of the cavern as its driver checked the street for traffic, then turned into the road and headed towards Hyde Park Corner. Sitting across from the luxury apartment block, dressed in a hired chauffeur's uniform at the wheel of the rented Volvo estate, Jim Rawlings breathed a sigh of relief. Gazing unobserved across the Belgravia street, he had seen what he'd hoped for. The husband had been at the wheel with his wife beside him. Moving the automatic shift into drive, he eased out of the line of parked cars and went after the Daimler Jaguar. It was a crisp, bright morning, with a pale wash of light over Green Park in the east and the street lights still on. Rawlings had been at the stakeout since 5 o'clock. A grey uniformed chauffeur in a big car in Belgravia attracts no attention, least of all with 4 suitcases and a hamper in the back on the morning of the 31st of December. He was 50 yards behind the Jaguar at Hyde Park Corner, allowing a truck to move between them. Up Park Lane, Rawlings had one momentary misgiving. There was a branch of Coote's Bank there, and he feared the couple in the Jaguar might pause to drop the diamonds into the night safe. At Marble Arch he breathed a second sigh of relief. The limousine sped straight up Great Cumberland Place, joined Gloucester Place, and kept on north. So the occupants of the luxury apartment on the 8th floor of Fontenoy House were not leaving the items with Cootes. Either they had them in the car and were taking them to the country, or they were leaving them for the New Year period in the apartment. Rawlings was confident it would be the latter. He tailed the Jaguar to Hendon, watched it speeding into the last mile before the M1 motorway, and then turned back towards central London. Evidently, as he'd hoped, they were going to join the wife's brother, the Duke of Sheffield, at his estates in North Yorkshire, a full 6-hour drive away. That would give him a minimum of 24 hours, more than he needed. He had no doubts that he could take the apartment of Fontenoy House. He was, after all, one of the best cracksmen in London. 1,000 miles to the east, the old man standing at the window of the sitting-room in a third-floor front apartment of Prospect Mirror 3 was thinking of midnight. It would herald the 1st of January 1987, his 75th birthday. The hour was well past midday, but he was still in a robe. There was little enough cause these days to rise early or spruce up to go to the office. The doorbell rang. It puzzled him. Prospect Mirror 3 is a totally KGB-owned block in a quiet back street of central Moscow, with mainly senior KGB tenants and a few foreign ministry people. A visitor would have to check in with the concierge. When he opened the door, a man stood there alone. He was youthful and looked fit, sheathed in a well-cut greatcoat with a warm fur shapka without insignia on his head. Blank blue eyes stared at the old man with neither friendship nor hostility. "Comrade Colonel Philby?" he asked. "Yes." "I am Major Pavlov of the 9th Directorate, attached to the personal staff of the General Secretary of the CPSU. "Indeed," said Philby. "This is for you, Comrade Colonel." The Major held out a long envelope of high-quality paper. Philby took it. "This also," said Major Pavlov, and held out a small square of pasteboard with a phone number on it. "Thank you," said Philby. Without a further word, the Major inclined his head briefly, turned on his heel, and went back down the corridor. Seconds later, from his window, Philby watched the sleek, black Chaika limousine slide away from the front entrance. Harold Philby slit the envelope with a kitchen knife, extracted the letter, and spread it on the sitting-room table. He was impressed. It was from the General Secretary of the CPSU personally, handwritten in the Soviet leader's neat, clerkish script and, of course, in Russian. In the top right-hand corner were the words, AM Wednesday, 31st of December, 1986. The text came below. It read, Dear Philby, my attention has been drawn to a remark made by you at a recent dinner party in Moscow, to wit, that the political stability of Great Britain is constantly overestimated here in Moscow, and never more so than at the present time. I would be happy to receive from you an expansion and clarification of this remark. Put this explanation in written form and direct it to me personally without retaining any copies or using secretaries. When it is ready, call the number Major Pavlov has given you. Ask to speak to him personally, and he will come to your residence to collect it. My felicitations upon your birthday tomorrow. Sincerely, the letter ended with the signature. Philby let out his breath slowly. So, Kryachkov's dinner on the 26th for senior officers of the KGB had been bugged after all. Jim Rawlings spent the hour between 9 and 10 that night, sitting in another, smaller rented car outside Fontenoy House. He was dressed in a beautifully cut dinner jacket and attracted no attention. The flat he targeted was, of course, in darkness, but he was happy to see that lights were on in the apartments above and below it. In each, to judge from the appearance of guests at the windows, New Year parties were getting underway. At 10, with his car parked discreetly in a side street 2 blocks away, he sauntered into the front entrance of Fontenoy House. Inside the lobby, on the left-hand side, was the porter's lodge. Inside it, the night porter was watching his Japanese portable. He rose and came to his doorway as if to speak. Rawlings was carrying a bottle of champagne decorated with a huge ribbon bow. He waved a hand in tipsy greeting. "Evening," he called, and added, "Oh, Happy New Year." If the old porter was thinking of asking for identification or destination, he thought better of it. There were at least 6 parties going on in the block. Half of them seemed to be open house, so how was he to check guest lists? "Oh, thank you, sir. Happy New Year, sir," he called. But the dinner-jacketed back had gone down the corridor. He returned to his movie. Rawlings used the stairs to the 1st floor, then the lift to the 8th. At 10:05 he was outside the door of the apartment he sought. From his trouser pocket he produced a ring of 12 skeleton keys, all made up in his own workshop. He selected and tested 3, one after the other, and settled for the 6th on the ring. Inserting it into the chub, he began to detect the pressure points inside the lock. Then, using a flat pack of slim steel files from his top pocket, he started to work on the softer metal of the skeleton. Inserting the finished skeleton into the chub lock, he turned it slowly and carefully. It went fully back. He waited for 60 seconds. No bells. He let out a sigh and went to work on the Yale with a fine steel spike. That took 60 seconds, and the door swung quietly open. By 1 minute to midnight, the noise of the party in the flat above was horrendous. Then suddenly it quietened as somebody roared for silence. In the quiet, Rawlings could hear the television he had switched on in the sitting room. The TV commentator chatted away the seconds to midnight as people across the kingdom charged their glasses. Then the quarters began to sound. After the quarters there was a pause. Then Big Ben spoke. Bong! The thunderous boom of the first stroke of midnight. It echoed in 20 million homes across the land. It crashed through the apartment on the 9th floor of Fontenoy House and was itself eclipsed by the roar of cheering and auld lang syne. As the first boom rang out on the 8th floor, Jim Rawlings blew open the safe. The flat crack went unnoticed, save by himself. The plumes of smoke were clearing. The door of the safe looked as if it had been cleft from top to bottom by a blunt axe wielded by a giant. The part he'd opened was large enough for him to peer inside. A cash box and a velvet bag. He eased out the bag, undid the drawstring, and emptied the contents onto the coffee table. They glittered and flared in the light. as if they contained their own fire. The Glen diamonds. Rawlings put the remainder of his equipment back in the false champagne bottle before he realized he had an unforeseen problem. The pendant and the earrings would slip into his trouser pockets, but the tiara was wider and higher than he'd thought. He glanced round for a receptacle that would attract no attention. It was lying on top of the bureau a few feet away. He emptied the contents of the attaché case into the bowl of an armchair, a collection of wallets, credit cards, pens, address books, and a couple of folders. It was exactly right. The case took all the Glen suite and the champagne bottle, which might have seemed odd if seen leaving a party. With a last glance round the sitting room, Rawlings switched off the light, stepped back into the hall, and closed the door. Once in the corridor, he relocked the main door with the Chubb lock, and 60 seconds later strolled past the porter's lodge and out into the night. The old man did not even look up. 4 hours later, the owner of the apartment of Fontenoy House returned alone to the capital. A tall, greying, and distinguished man in his mid-50s. He drove straight into the basement car park using his own plastic admission card and took his own suitcase up in the elevator to the 8th floor. He was in a foul mood. He had driven for 6 hours, having left his brother-in-law's stately home 3 days prematurely, following a blazing row with his wife. He entered the hall of his apartment and stared at the scene in open-mouthed horror. What caught his eye at once was the scorched wall and cloven safe door right ahead of him. He crossed the room in several strides and peered into the safe. There was no doubt. The diamonds were gone. He looked round again, saw his possessions scattered in the armchair by the fire. He sank into the other fireside armchair as white as a sheet. "Oh, my God," he breathed. He seemed stunned by the nature of the disaster and remained in the chair for 10 minutes, breathing heavily and staring at the disarray. Finally, he rose and went to the telephone. With a trembling forefinger, he dialed a number. At the other end it rang and rang, but there was no reply. The following morning, just before 11, John Preston walked down Curzon Street towards the headquarters of the department he worked for. Most of the civil service that Friday morning were being allowed to bridge over from Thursday, the New Year's Day, which was a public holiday anyway, into the weekend. But Brian Harcourt Smith had asked him to come in specially, so he had to come. He suspected he knew what the Deputy Director General of MI5 wanted to talk about. For 3 years, over half the time he'd spent with MI5, John Preston had been in F branch of the service, dealing with surveillance of extremist political organizations. For 2 of those years, he had been in F1, concerned with the penetration of extreme left-wing elements into Britain's Labour Party. The result of his investigations, his report, had been submitted 2 weeks earlier, just before Christmas. He was surprised it had been read and digested so quickly. He was sorry he would not be seeing the Director General personally. He liked Sir Bernard Hemmings. But it was an open secret inside Five that the old man was ill and spending less and less time in the office. In his absences, the day-to-day running of the department was passing more and more into the hands of his ambitious deputy. Harcourt Smith received Preston warmly in his office, immaculately dressed as ever. Preston was wary of the warmth. Others had been received just as warmly, so went the stories, and had been out of the service a week later. Harcourt Smith seated Preston in front of his desk and himself behind it. Preston's report lay on the blotter. "Now, John, this report of yours. You'll understand, of course, that I take it, along with all your work, extremely seriously." "Thank you," said Preston. "So much so," Harcourt Smith went on, "that I have spent a good part of the festivities break right here in this office to reread it and consider it." Preston thought it wiser to remain silent. "It is, how shall I put it, pretty radical. No holds barred, eh? The question is Is it all absolutely true? Can it be verified? This is what I should be asked. Look, Brian, I've spent 2 years on that investigation. My people went deep, very deep. The facts, where I've stated them as facts, are true. Ah, John, I'd never dispute any facts presented by you. But the conclusions drawn from them are based on logic, I think, said Preston. A great discipline. I used to study it, resumed Harcourt Smith. Look, John, leave this with me a little while longer. I'll have to think on it and perhaps take a few soundings before I decide where I can best place it. By the by, how do you like F1D? I like it fine, said Preston, rising also. I may have something for you that you'll like even more, said Harcourt Smith. When Preston had gone, Harcourt Smith stared for several minutes at the door through which he'd passed. He seemed lost in thought. Simply to shred the file, which he privately regarded as embarrassing and possibly one day dangerous, was not possible. It had been formally presented by a section head. It had a file number. He thought long and hard. Then he took his red ink pen and wrote carefully on the cover of the Preston report. He pressed his buzzer for his secretary. Mabel, he said when she entered, take this down to register yourself, please. Right now. The girl glanced at the cover of the file. Across it were written the letters NFA and Brian Harcourt Smith's initials. In the service, NFA stands for no further action. The report was to be buried. It was not until the 4th of January, the following Sunday, that the apartment owner at Fontenoy House was able to get an answer from the number he'd been ringing every hour for 3 days. It was a brief conversation when it took place, but it resulted in his meeting with another man just before the hour of luncheon in a recessed alcove of one of the public rooms in a very discreet West End hotel. The newcomer was about 60, with iron-grey hair, soberly dressed, and with the air of a kind of civil servant. I'm terribly sorry I wasn't available this past 3 days, he said. Being a single man, I was invited by some kind friends to spend the New Year period with them out of town. Now, what seems to be the problem? The apartment owner told him in short, clear sentences. The other man considered the narrative with a deepening gravity. You're quite right, of course, he said at length. Could be very serious. When you returned on Thursday night, did you call the police, or at any time since? No, I thought it better to talk to you first. Ah, pity in a way. It's too late now anyway. Their forensic people would establish the blowing of the safe was 3 or 4 days old. It's too late to call in the police now. Then what the hell do I do? They have simply got to be recovered. How long will your wife remain away from London? Who knows? She enjoys it up in Yorkshire. Some weeks, I hope. Then we shall have to effect a replacement of the damaged safe with a new and identical model. Also a replica set of the Glen diamonds. It will take time to arrange. But how about what's been stolen? They can't just be left somewhere out there on the loose. I've got to have them back. True, nodded the other. Look, as you may imagine, my people have some contact in the world of diamonds. I'll cause inquiries to be made. I'll see if the burglar can be traced and the things recovered. The man rose and prepared to leave. His friend remained seated, evidently deeply worried. The sober-suited man was equally dismayed, but he hid it better. Do nothing and say nothing untoward, he advised. Keep your wife in the country as long as possible. Behave perfectly normally. Rest assured, I shall be in touch. The British Security Service, better known as MI5, does not live in one single building. Discreetly but inconveniently, it is split up into 4 office blocks. The headquarters are in Charles Street. The next biggest block is in Gordon Street, known simply as Gordon and nothing else, just as the head office is known as Charles. The department is divided into 6 branches scattered throughout the buildings. F. Branch lives at Gordon on the 4th floor, and it was to his office there that John Preston made his way that January morning. He might not have thought his report of 3 weeks earlier would establish him as Brian Harcourt Smith's flavour of the month, but he still believed his report would go to the desk of the Director-General himself, Sir Bernard Hemmings. Hemmings, he was confident, would feel able to impart its information and, admittedly, part conjectural findings to the permanent Under-Secretary of the Home Office, the political ministry commanding MI5. A good private Under-Secretary would probably feel his minister should glance at it, and the Home Secretary could have drawn the attention of the Prime Minister to it. The memorandum on his desk when he arrived indicated this was not going to happen. After reading the sheet, he sat back, lost in thought. It was from the head of B4, Promotions, personally, and advised him that he was, as of that day, transferred and promoted to head of C1A. The tone was in the cosy friendliness that is supposed to soften the blow. I am advised by the DDG that it would be so helpful if the new year could begin with all fresh postings occupied. Most grateful if you could tidy up any outstanding things and hand over to young Maxwell without too much delay, even within a couple of days if possible. My warmest best wishes for your satisfaction with the new post. Blah, 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 thought Preston. C1 he knew as Civil Service Personnel and Buildings, and A section meant within the capital. He was to be in charge of security in all Her Majesty's ministries in London. It's a bloody policeman's job, he snorted, and began to call up his team to say goodbye. A mile away across London, Jim Rawlings opened the door of a small but exclusive jewellery shop in a side road not 200 yards from the surging traffic of Bond Street. He was wearing a neat, dark suit, silk shirt and muted tie, and carried a dully gleaming attaché case. The girl behind the counter looked up and took him in with a glance of appreciation. She pushed out her chest and flashed a bright smile. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to see Mr. Zablonsky, personal." His Cockney accent indicated he was unlikely to be a customer. Her face fell. "Your rep?" she asked. "Just say Mr. James would like to speak to him," said Rawlings. But at that moment the mirrored door at the rear of the shop opened, and Louis Zablonsky came out. He was a short, wizened man of 56, but looked older. "Mr. James," he beamed, "how nice to see you. Please, come into my office. How have you been keeping?" He ushered Rawlings through the counter and into his inner sanctum. "It's all right, Sandra, my dear." Inside his small and cluttered office, he closed and locked the mirrored door, through which a view of the outer shop could be seen. He gestured Rawlings to the chair in front of his antique desk, and took the swivel chair behind it. A single spotlight beamed down on the blotter. He eyed Rawlings keenly. "Well now, Jim, what have you been up to?" "Got something for you, Louis. Something you'll like. So don't tell me it's rubbish." Rawlings flicked open his attaché case. Zablonsky spread his hands. "Jim, would I—" His words were cut off as he saw what Rawlings was placing on the blotter. When they were all there, he stared at them in disbelief. "The Glen suite?" he breathed. "You've gone and nicked the Glen diamonds. It's not even been in the papers yet." "So maybe they're still away from London," said Rawlings. "There was no alarm raised. I'm good, you know that." "The best, Jim, the best. But the Glen suite, why didn't you tell me?" Zablonsky was still admiring the diamonds as a true connoisseur will adore any masterpiece. He recalled vaguely having read somewhere that in the mid-60s Lady Fiona Glen had married a rising young civil servant who by the mid-80s had been a senior mandarin in one of the ministries. "So, what do you think, Louis?" I'm impressed, my dear Jim, very impressed, but also perplexed. These are not just ordinary stones. These are identifiable anywhere in the diamond world. What am I to do with them? So you tell me, said Rawlings. Louis Oblonsky spread his hands wide. There are two options. One is to find a very rich buyer who would want to buy the famous Glen diamonds, knowing he could never display them or admit ownership. A rich miser content to gloat over them in privacy. There are such people, but very few. When could you find a buyer like that? Oblonsky shrugged. This year? Next year? Sometime? Never. You can't just advertise in the personal columns. Too long, said Rawlings. The other way. Prize them out of their settings? That act alone would reduce the value to £600,000. Repolish them and sell them separately as 4 unmatched individual gems. One might get 300,000, but the repolisher would want his cut. If I carried those costs personally, I think I could let you have 100,000. But at the end of the day, after the sales had been completed. So what can you let me have up front? I can't live on fresh air, Louis. Who can? They talked for another 30 minutes and clinched their deal. From his safe, Louis Oblonsky took £7,000 in cash. Rawlings opened the attaché case and laid the wads of used notes inside. Nice case, said Oblonsky. You treat yourself. Rawlings shook his head. Came with a swag, he said. Oblonsky tut-tutted and waved a finger under Rawlings' nose. Get rid of it, Jim. Never keep anything from a job. Not worth the risk. Rawlings considered, nodded, made his farewells, and left. John Preston was installing himself in his new office on the second floor. He cast his eye down the list of ministry buildings that came under his section A. The big ones for him were the Foreign Office, Cabinet Office, and Defence, all of which received cosmic-rated papers. But each had pretty tight security handled by its own internal security team. Preston sighed. He started to make a series of phone calls, setting up getting-to-know-you meetings with the security chiefs in each of the main ministries. Between calls, he glanced at the pile of personal stuff he'd brought down from his old office 2 floors above. Among the files was his report of the previous month, his own personal copy. Other than the one he knew to be NFA'd in the registry, it was the only copy in existence. He shrugged and put it at the back of the safe. It would probably never be examined again, but he didn't see why he shouldn't keep it, for old time's sake. After all, it had taken a hell of a lot of sweat to put it together. On January the 7th, Philby dispatched to the Soviet leader a long memorandum about the infiltration of the British Labour Party by the hard left. His concluding paragraph stated, "To judge by recent public opinion polls, the percentage gap between the ruling Conservatives and the Labour Party has closed to a few points. Bearing in mind also that under the British system, 80 marginal seats actually control the outcome of an election, the Labour Party has a chance of being returned at the next British general election as the government. Were that to happen, our friends of the hard left plan to topple Neil Kinnock from the leadership of the Labour Party in the hour of his victory and impose upon Britain her first Marxist-Leninist premier, along with a truly revolutionary socialist legislative programme. Yours sincerely, Harold Adrian Russell Philby." That same morning, John Preston entered the lobby of the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall, and was led up the lift and down several corridors to the office of the Ministry's head of Internal Security. Brigadier Bertie Capstick had changed little since John Preston had last seen him years ago in Ulster. Big, florid and genial, with apple cheeks that made him look more like a farmer than a soldier. He came forward with a roar of, "Johnny, my boy, as I live and breathe, come in, come in." Capstick sat him down and produced a bottle of single malt from a filing cabinet. Fancy a snort? Bit early, protested Preston. Nonsense, for old time's sake. Capstick sat himself down and pushed the glass towards Preston across his desk. So, what have they done with you, my boy? Preston grimaced. I told you on the phone what they've given me, he said. Bloody policeman's job. No disrespect to you, Bertie. Oh, don't worry, Johnny. Now I know you're in the seat, I'll call if anything crops up here that looks bigger than swiping the Christmas fund. How's Julia, by the way? I'm afraid she's left me. 3 years ago. Oh, sorry to hear that. Another fella? No, not then. There's someone now, I think. Just the job, you know. Capstick nodded grimly. My Betty's always been very good like that, he ruminated. Been away from home half my life. She always stuck by, kept the fire burning. Still, no life for a woman. Seen it happen before, many times. Still, awfully bad luck. Well, I must be going, Bertie. You know where I am if anything big blows up. Of course, of course. Bertie Capstick lumbered to the door to see him out. Take care of yourself, Johnny. There aren't many of us good guys left anymore. They parted on a jocular note, and Preston went back to Gordon Street. Jim Rawlings made himself a cup of espresso and thought things over. He had intended to burn the attaché case among the rubble, but it was so beautifully hand-tooled, the dull burnished leather glowed like metal. Against his better judgment and the warning of Zablonsky, he had decided to risk keeping it. He went to a high cupboard and brought it down. He noticed the stud on the hinge side of the case that slid sideways when pushed hard with the ball of the thumb. From inside the case he heard a sound. When he reopened the case, the base had risen half an inch at one side. With a paper knife he eased up the base and glanced inside the flat compartment between the case's real base and the false one. With tweezers he extracted the 10 sheets of paper that lay within. Rawlings was no expert on government documents, but he could understand the rubric of the Ministry of Defence, and the words "top secret" are understandable in any man's language. He sat back and whistled softly. Rawlings was a burglar and a thief, but like much of the London underworld, he would not have anyone rubbish his country. He knew whose apartment he'd burgled, but the robbery had not been reported yet, and he suspected, for reasons he could only now fathom, that it might never be. He had already handled the papers without gloves, and he knew his own prints were on file. He dared not identify himself, so he had to wipe the papers clean with a cloth, erasing the traitor's fingerprints as well. That Sunday afternoon he mailed a plain brown envelope, well sealed and with an excess of stamps, from a post-box in the Elephant Castle. There was no collection until Monday morning, and the package did not arrive until the Tuesday. That day, the 20th of January, Brigadier Bertie Capstick came on the phone to John Preston at Gordon. The bluff geniality of his voice was gone. Johnny, remember what we were talking about the other day? If anything cropped up? Well, it has. Someone has mailed me something in the post. No, not a bomb, though it might turn out worse. It looks as if we have a leak here, Johnny, and he has to be very, very high. That means it comes under your department. I think you'd better come down and take a look. That morning also 2 workmen arrived at an 8th-floor apartment at Fontenoy House. During the day they chipped the damaged safe out of the masonry of the wall and replaced it with an identical model. By nightfall they had redecorated the wall as it had been before. Then they left. The General Secretary's response to Philby's memorandum was surprisingly and gratifyingly prompt. Major Pavlov, the inscrutable and cold-eyed young officer from the 9th Directorate, brought another handwritten letter from the General Secretary personally. In it, the Soviet leader thanked his friend Philby for his efforts. In consequence, he estimated the victory of the British Labour Party at the next general election to have become a matter of top priority for the USSR. He was calling into being a small, restricted advisory committee, responsible and answerable only to himself, to counsel him upon possible future courses. He required and requested Harold Philby to act as advisor to that committee. Preston sat in the office of a very worried Bertie Capstick and examined the 10 photocopied sheets spread out on the desk, reading each carefully. Looks like very high-level stuff. The tops, said Capstick gloomily. Some of it very sensitive, concerning our NATO allies. Contingency plans for NATO to counter a variety of Soviet threats, that sort of stuff. All right, said Preston. Let's just run through the possibilities. Supposing this was sent back by a public-spirited citizen who for one reason or another did not want to be identified. Where could such a person have got them? A briefcase left in a cloakroom, a taxi, or a club? Capstick shook his head. Not legally, Johnny. This stuff should never under any circumstances have left the building. The people who would even begin to have access to this sort of stuff know the rules. No one, but no one, may take this sort of stuff home to study. So, it had to be taken outside illegally. Gross negligence or a deliberate attempt to leak? Look at the dates of origin, said Capstick. These 10 sheets cover a full month. There's no chance they all arrived on a single desk in a single day. They had to be collected over a period. Preston, using his handkerchief, eased the 10 documents back into their envelope of arrival. I'll have to take them to Charles Street, Bertie. May I use your phone? He called Charles Street and asked to be put straight through to the office of Sir Bernard Hemmings. The Director-General was in, and after a delay and some insistence from Preston, took the call personally. Preston simply asked for a personal appointment within minutes, and got it. He put down the phone and turned to Brigadier Capstick. Bertie, for the moment, don't do anything or say anything to anyone. Just play out the day as if it was another routine day. I'll be in touch. Sir Bernard Hemmings, the old spy-catcher, looked grey, as if he was in pain, which he frequently was. The disease that was growing deep inside him showed nothing to the observer, but the medical tests left no doubt. A year, they had said, and not operable. He was due to retire on the 1st of September, 6 weeks before his 60th birthday. Preston explained briefly and concisely what had happened at the Ministry of Defence that morning, and the view of Capstick regarding the feasibility of the document's departure from the Ministry being anything other than a deliberate act. "Oh, my God! Not another," murmured Sir Bernard. Years later, the memory of Vassal and Priam still rankled. "Well, John, where do you want to start?" "Well, I've told Bertie Capstick to stay silent for a moment," said Preston. "If we have a genuine traitor inside the Ministry, there's a second mystery. Who sent the stuff back to us? Passer-by, sneak thief, wife with remorse feelings? We don't know. But if we could find that person, we might find where they got the stuff. The papers might have retained prints. I'd like Scotland Yard to test them all, under supervision, of course. After that, we may know where to go next." "Good thinking. You handle that side of it," said Sir Bernard. "We can assume that the person responsible, I'll call him or her, Chummy, is aware of the loss of those documents from their possession. And we can hope Chummy does not know they've been anonymously returned to the Ministry. Still, Chummy's likely to be worried and lying low. If I put in a whole team of ferrets, Chummy will know it's over. The last thing we need is a moonlight flit and a starring role at an international press conference in Moscow. I suggest for the moment we try to keep it low profile and see if we can get an early lead. As a newly appointed C1A, you can reasonably make a tour of the ministries and check, in an apparently routine fashion, on procedures. It's as good a cover as we'll get. With a bit of luck, Chummy will think nothing of it." Capstick had done his bit, trumpeting that the new head of C1A was going through all the ministries, showing what an eager beaver he was. The registry clerks rolled their eyes to heaven and cooperated with thinly veiled exasperation. But it gave Preston access to the files, the withdrawals and the returns, to whom, and most importantly, over what dates. On January the 27th, he reported back to Charles Street with an interim progress sheet. It was Brian Harcourt Smith who received him. Sir Bernard was away from the office again. "Glad you've got something for us, John," said Harcourt Smith. "Shoot." "First," said Preston, "the documents. Incidentally, there were no fingerprints. They were carefully selected as if our thief was taking the sort of stuff he'd been asked for. That requires expertise. I think that counts out really low-level staffers." Harcourt Smith nodded. "So you think it's upstairs?" "Yes, Brian, I do. Here's the second reason why. I spent 2 nights checking every single copy made. There are no discrepancies. So it leaves only one thing, the shredding of copies. Someone has had 3 copies to shred and shredded only 2, smuggling the third out of the building. There were 12 men who had the originals out from registry. Of these, 3 were away for varying reasons on the days shown as the withdrawal dates on the photocopies returned by the anonymous sender. Those men made their withdrawals on other days and must be counted out. That leaves 9. Of those 9, 4 never had any copies made for advisory purposes at all." "And then there were 5, murmured Harcourt Smith. "Right. 3 of those 5, during the period, had other documents on their desks that fall well within the type of the stolen papers, and which were much more interesting, but which were not stolen. By rights they ought to have been stolen. So I come down to 2 men. Nothing certain, just prime suspects." He pushed 2 files across the desk to Harcourt Smith, who looked at them with curiosity. "Sir Richard Peters and Mr. George Berenson," he read. "The first being the Assistant Under-Secretary responsible for international and industrial policy, and the second, the Deputy Chief of Defence Procurement. Both men would have personal staffs, of course." "Yes." "But you are not listing them as suspects. May I ask why?" "They are suspects," said Preston. "Those 2 men will probably rely on their staff to make the copies and later shred them. But that widens the net to a dozen people. If one could clear the 2 top men, trapping the underling with the department head's cooperation would be child's play. I'd like to start with the top 2. "What are you asking for?" asked Harcourt Smith. "Total covert surveillance on both men for a limited period, with postal intercept and telephone tap," said Preston. "I'll ask the committee," said Harcourt Smith. "But these are senior men. You'd better be right." Every Friday in MI5 is held what they call the bidding conference. At the bidding conference, the directors put in their requests for what they think they need: finance, technical services, and surveillance of their pet suspects. The pressure is always on Director A, who controls the watchers. That week, the Friday conference was preempted as far as the watchers were concerned. Those attending on Friday, the 30th of January, found the cupboard was bare. 2 days earlier, Harcourt Smith, at the requirement of the committee, had allocated Preston the watchers he wanted. At 6 watches to a team and 4 teams in every 24 hours, and with 2 men to survey, he had taken 48 watchers off other duties. "There are 2 targets," the briefing officers told the teams. "This one and this one. One is married, but his wife is away in the country. They live in a West End apartment, and he usually walks to the ministry every morning, about 1.5 miles. The other is a bachelor and lives outside Edenbridge in Kent. He commutes by train every day. We start tomorrow." Technical support took care of the telephone tap and the mail intercept, and both Sir Richard Peters and Mr. George Berenson went under the microscope. Friday the 13th is supposed to be an unlucky day, but for John Preston it was the opposite. It brought him his first break in the wearisome tailing of 2 senior civil servants. The surveillance had gone on for 16 days without result. Both men were creatures of habit, and neither was surveillance conscious. That is, they did not look for a tail, and therefore made the watcher's task easy, but boring. Preston, as operations controller, was in the radio link room in the basement at Cork Street when a call came through from the B team following Sir Richard Peters. "Joe's hailing a cab. We're behind him in the cars. In watcher parlance, the target is always Joe." When the B team came off shift, Preston had a session with its leader, Harry Birkinshaw. "So what happened, Harry?" Preston asked. "Well, he came out the ministry at the usual time, but instead of walking in the usual direction, he went as far as Trafalgar Square and hailed a cab. He dismissed it by Panzer's Delicatessen on Bayswater Road and ducked down Clanricarde Gardens. Halfway down, he shot into a front forecourt and went down the steps to the basement." "How long was he down the basement steps?" 30-40 seconds, said Birkinshaw. "Either he was letting damn fast or he had his own key. Looked like he'd stopped by to pick up mail or check for any." "What kind of house?" "Dirty-looking house, dirty-looking basement. It'll all be in the log in the morning. Do you mind if I go now? My feet are killing me." Preston spent the evening wondering about the incident. Why on earth would Sir Richard Peters want to visit a seedy flat in Bayswater? For 40 seconds? Pick up mail or leave a message? He arranged for the house to be put under surveillance as well, and a car with a man and a camera in it was there within an hour. On Monday morning, Preston visited the local town hall and had a look at the list of ratepayers for that street. The address listed only one householder, and Mr. Michael Z. Mifsud, owner-occupier, thought Preston, letting out the rest of the house as furnished accommodation. Tenants of unfurnished property would pay their own local rates. After lunch, Preston went to see Armstrong in finance at Charles Street. "Can I be an Inland Revenue inspector tomorrow?" he asked. Armstrong sighed. "I'll try and fix it. Call back before..." Just before 5 that afternoon, Preston picked up his Inland Revenue identification from finance. Armstrong gave him another card with a telephone number. "If there's a query, have the suspect phone that number. It's the Inland Revenue in Willesden Green. Ask for Mr. Charnley. He'll vouch for you. Your name is Brent, by the way." "So I see," said Preston. Mr. Michael Z. Mifsud, interviewed the next morning, was not a nice man. Unshaven, in a string vest, surly and uncooperative. But he let Preston into his grubby sitting room. "What you tell me?" protested Mifsud. "What income? All I make, I declare." "Mr. Mifsud, I assure you it's a routine spot check, but if, God forbid, any of these flats are let out for immoral purposes, that's different. I'd be duty-bound to pass my findings on to the police. You know what living off immoral earnings means." "What do you mean?" protested Mifsud. "It's no immoral earnings here. It's all good tenants. They pay rents, I pay taxes, everything." But he had gone a shade paler and grudgingly produced the rent books. Preston noted the basement was let to a Mr. Dickey at £40 per week. Mifsud had never met the basement tenant. He paid by cash, regular as clockwork. But there was a typed letter originating the tenancy. It was signed by Mr. Dickey. Preston took the letter with him when he left, over Mr. Mifsud's protests. By lunchtime he had handed it to Scotland Yard's graphology people, along with copies of Sir Richard Peters' handwriting and signature. By close of play the Yard had rung him back. Same handwriting, but disguised. So, thought Preston, Peters himself maintains his own pied-à-terre, for cosy meetings with his controller, most probably. Preston gave his orders. If Peters started heading towards the flat again, he, Preston, was to be alerted at once wherever he was. Wednesday dragged by, and Thursday. Then, as he left the ministry, Sir Richard Peters hailed a cab again and directed it towards Bayswater. The watchers contacted Preston in the bar at Gordon Street, whence he called Scotland Yard and hauled the designated Special Branch Sergeant out of the canteen. He gave the man down the telephone the address. "Meet me on the pavement opposite as fast as you can, but no noise," he said. They all congregated in the cold darkness of the pavement opposite the suspect house. Harry Birkinshaw materialized out of the shadows. "How long's he been in there, Harry?" "55 minutes," said Birkinshaw. "Any visitors?" "Nope." Preston took out his search warrant and showed it to Sergeant Lander. "Okay, let's go in," he said. They descended the steps in silence, and Preston rang the bell. There was the clack of heels inside, and the door opened. Framed in the light was a woman. When she saw the two men, the smile of welcome dropped from her heavily carmined lips. She tried to shut the door, but Lander pushed it open, elbowed her aside, and ran past her. She was no spring chicken, but she'd done her best. Wavy dark hair fell to shoulder length to frame the heavily made-up face. Before she'd time to close the front of her housecoat, Preston caught a glimpse of black stockings and suspenders. He guided her by the elbow down the hall to the sitting-room and sat her down. They sat in silence while Lander searched the flat. After 10 minutes he emerged from the rear area, slightly flushed. "Not a sign of him, sir. He must have done a bunk through the back and over the garden fences in the next street." Just then there was a ring at the front door. Lander went to open the front door. Preston heard an oath and the sound of running footsteps. Later it transpired a man had come to the door, and on seeing the detective opening it, had tried to flee. Birkinshaw's people had closed in at the top of the steps and held the man until the pursuing Lander had got the cuffs on him. After that, the man went quiet and was led away to a police car. Preston sat with the woman and listened to the tumult die away. "It's not an arrest," he said quietly. "But I think we should go to head office. Don't you?" The woman nodded miserably. "Do you mind if I get changed first?" "I think that would be a good idea, Sir Richard," said Preston. An hour later, a burly but very gay truck driver was released from Paddington Green Police Station, having been seriously advised on the unwisdom of answering blind date advertisements in adult contact magazines. John Preston escorted Sir Richard Peters to the country, stayed with him listening to what he had to say until midnight, drove back to London, and spent the rest of the night writing his report. This report was in front of each member of the Paragon Committee when they met at 11 on the Friday morning. The expressions of bewilderment and distaste were general. Preston was shown in 30 minutes later. The senior men examined him with some curiosity. He was given a chair at the centre of the table, opposite his own Director General and DDG. Sir Anthony Plum explained the committee's dilemma. "Just what happened between you?" asked Sir Anthony. "In the car on the way down to the country, he broke down. He admitted his taste for transvestite fetishism, but seemed stunned by the accusation of treason. He denied it hotly, and continued to do so until I left him with his minders." "Well, he would," said Brian Harcourt-Smith. "He could still be our man." "Yes, indeed he could," agreed Preston. "But your impression, your gut feeling," murmured Sir Nigel Irvine, the chief of MI6. Preston took a deep breath. "Gentlemen, I don't think he is." "May we ask why?" said Sir Anthony. "As Sir Nigel implies, it's just a gut feeling," said Preston. "I've seen two men whose world had shattered about them and who believed they had not much left to live for. When men in that mood spill, they tend to spill the lot. If Sir Richard Peters was blackmailed into treachery, I think he would either have admitted it when the House of Cards came tumbling down, or at least shown no surprise at the accusation of treason. He did show complete surprise. He could have been acting. But I think he was beyond acting by then. Either that, or he ought to get an Oscar." "What do you think, Nigel?" asked Sir Anthony Plum. Irvine nodded. "I too have seen the mood about to collapse that overtakes a traitor when he's exposed. So, if not Peters, that seems to leave George Benson." "May I make a suggestion?" asked Preston, quietly. There was some surprise. He had not been asked here to make suggestions, but Sir Anthony Plum was a courteous man. Please do, he said. The 10 documents returned by the anonymous sender all fell within a pattern. 7 of them contained material affecting Britain's and NATO's naval dispositions in the Atlantic, north and south. Would it be possible to cause to pass across Mr. Berenson's desk a document of such irresistible tastiness that, if he is the guilty party, he would be sorely tempted to abstract a copy and make a move to pass it on? A number of heads around the table nodded thoughtfully.
"Smoke him out, do you mean?"
mused Sir Bernard Hemmings.
"What do you think, Nigel?"
"You know, I think I like it. Might just work. Could it be done, Perry?" Sir Perry Jones pursed his lips. "Actually, more realistically than you think," he said. "When I was in America, the idea was mooted that we might one day need to increase the refueling and revictualling level our facilities in Ascension Island, to include facilities for our nuclear submarines. I suppose I could prepare a very confidential personal paper and slip it across 4 or 5 desks, including Berenson's." "Would Berenson normally see that kind of paper?" asked Sir Paddy Strickland. "Certainly," said Jones. "Some copies could be run off for close colleagues' eyes only, then returned and shredded, original back to me, by hand." It was agreed. The Ascension Island paper would land on George Berenson's desk on Tuesday. On the first day, nothing happened. That night, Brigadier Capstick with John Preston went into the Ministry of Defence while the staff were sleeping and checked the number of photocopies run off. There were 3 by George Berenson. On the evening of the second day, Mr. Berenson did something strange. The watchers reported that in the middle of the evening he left his Belgravia apartment and walked to a nearby call box. They couldn't tell the number he dialed, but he spoke only a few words, replaced the receiver, and walked home. On Thursday, the third day, George Berenson left the ministry at the usual time, hailed a cab, and went to St. John's Wood. In the high street of this parish was an ice-cream parlour and coffee shop. The defence official went in, sat down, and ordered a sundae. John Preston sat in the basement radio room in Cork Street and listened to the watcher team reporting in. It was Len Stewart leading the 18. "I've got 2 people in there," he said, "and 2 more out here on the street, plus my cars." "What's he doing in there?" asked Preston. "Can't see," said Stewart over his personal radio. "Have to wait until the people in there with him get a chance to tell me." After 30 minutes, the official called for his bill, took it to the cash desk, paid, and left. "He's back on the street," called Len Stewart. "My 2 have stayed inside." "Can you ask them what he did in there?" asked Preston. Stewart's voice came over the air again. "There's a taxi coming. He's hailing it. Hold on. Here are my people from inside." There was a pause in transmission. Then, "It seems he ate his ice cream and completed the Daily Telegraph crossword. Then he paid up and left." "Where's the paper?" asked Preston. "We left it when he finished." "Hold on." Then the proprietor came over and cleared the table, taking the dirty bowl and paper back into the kitchen area. "He's inside the taxi and cruising. What do we do? Stay with him?" "Len, leave 1 car and driver to tail the taxi, but switch the rest of your people to the ice cream parlour." "Will do," said Len Stewart, and went off the air. The taxi went straight to Mr. Berenson's West End club and dropped him off. He went inside. Len Stewart entered the ice cream shop and sat until closing time with a coffee and the Standard. Nothing happened. From Cork Street, Preston was trying to get a phone tap on the ice cream shop and a make on the proprietor. He turned out to be a Signor Benotti, a legal immigrant originally from Naples who'd led a blameless life for 20 years. Preston spent a sleepless night in Cork Street. Stewart's relief shift had moved in at 8 p.m. and watched the ice cream shop through the night. At 11, Stewart called in. "There's a small delivery van at the front door," he told Preston. "The vanman seems to be loading gallon tubs of ice cream. It seems they do a customer delivery service." Preston stirred his 20th cup of awful coffee. His mind was fogging with lack of sleep. Detach a car and 2 people to stay with the van. Note every recipient of ice cream deliveries. The ice cream delivery van made 12 calls that morning, all in the St. John's Wood Swiss Cottage area. The watchers noted every address. "Will you drop that list at Cork Street on your way home?" Preston asked Stewart. That evening, the phone-tap people reported Berenson had had 4 telephone calls while he was at home, including one in which the caller turned out to have a wrong number. He had made no outgoing calls. Everything was on tape. Did Preston want the tape to play over? There was nothing remotely suspicious on it. He thought he might as well. On Saturday morning, Preston played the longest shot of his life. Using a tape recorder set up by the technical support people and a variety of excuses to the householders, he called up each one of the recipients of the ice cream, asking whenever a woman answered if he might speak to her husband. Being Saturday, he got them all but one. One voice seemed slightly familiar. What was it? A hint of accent? Where could he have heard it before? He played the tape again. Possible. Not conclusive, but possible. Scotland Yard, among the copious facilities of its forensic science department, has a section devoted to voice analysis. Preston called Detective Sergeant Lander, got him at home, and it was Lander who fixed a priority meeting in Scotland Yard's voice analysis section that same Saturday afternoon. A thin young man with pebble glasses played Preston's tapes half a dozen times, watching the illuminated line on the oscilloscope screen rise and fall to record the tiniest shades of tone and timbre in the voices. "Same voice," he said at last. "No question about it." On Sunday, Preston identified the owner of the accented voice by using the diplomatic list. He finally telephoned Sir Bernard Hemmings at his Surrey home. "I think there's something that we should report to the Paragon Committee, sir," he said. The Paragon Committee met at 11, and Sir Anthony Plum asked Preston to make his report. There was an air of expectancy, although Sir Bernard Hemmings looked grave. Preston detailed the events of the first 2 days since the distribution of the Ascension Island paper as briefly as he could. There was a stir of interest at the news of Berenson's odd and very brief call from a public phone box on Wednesday evening. Preston went on to describe the visit to the ice cream parlour, the abandonment of the Daily Telegraph, and the fact that it was cleared away by the proprietor personally. "You believe the visit to the ice cream shop was the drop?" asked Sir Anthony Plum. "I'm sure of it," said Preston. The voice that dialed him that evening and established that the caller had obtained a wrong number, apologized and rang off, was the voice of one of the recipients of the ice cream. There was silence round the table. "Let me see if I understand," said Sir Perry Jones. "Berenson recovered from his 3 colleagues their photocopies of my fictitious paper and pretended to shred them all. In fact, he retained one. He folded it inside his newspaper and left it at the ice cream shop. The proprietor collected the paper, plastic-wrapped the classified document, and delivered it next morning to the controller in a tub of ice cream. The controller then alerted Berenson that he had got it. That is what I believe happened," said Preston. "So, what have you done since you made this connection, Mr. Preston?" asked Sir Anthony. "I have switched the surveillance from Mr. Berenson to the controller," said Preston. "I've identified him. In fact, this morning I joined the watchers and followed him from his Marylebone flat, where he lives alone as a bachelor, to his office. He's a foreign diplomat. His name is Mr. Jan Marias. He is an accredited diplomat on the staff of the Embassy of the Republic of South Africa." There was a stunned, disbelieving silence. Sir Paddy Strickland, in language not habitually favoured by diplomats, muttered, "Bloody hell." All eyes turned to Sir Nigel Irvine. He sat at the end of the table, badly shaken. He was thinking of General Henry Panner, head of South Africa's National Intelligence Service. For the South Africans to hire a few London crooks to burgle the archives of the African National Congress was one thing. To run a spy right inside the British Defence Ministry was, between services, a declaration of war. "I think, gentlemen, with your indulgence, I am going to have to ask for a few days to investigate this matter a little further," said Sir Nigel. The next day, Sir Nigel Irvine called Sir Bernard Hemmings at his home outside Farnham, where the ailing man was confined.
The great and good General Preneur swears by all that he holds to be holy that he has no knowledge of Jan Marias. He claims Marias does not work for him and never has. In fact, he has agreed to my request to receive our own investigator to carry out a joint hunt with his people. I want to send a man down there.
Preston flew to Johannesburg on the overnight flight of the 12th to the 13th of March. It was not until he was airborne that the information reached the desk of Brian Harcourt Smith. He was icily angry, but knew he'd been outranked. The Albion Committee, appointed by the head of the Soviet state to devise a plan to disrupt the British general election, consisted of Professor Krilov, General Marchenko, Dr. Rogoff, who was a physicist and chess grandmaster, and Harold Philby, the traitor. The committee reported to the General Secretary on the 12th. "We have devised a plan, Comrade General Secretary," said Dr. Rogoff, "to cause a destabilization among the British people that would make the Sarajevo affair and the Berlin Reichstag fire pale into insignificance. We have called it Plan Aurora." It took him an hour to read the full details. He glanced up occasionally to see if there was any reaction, but the General Secretary was a Grand Master in a much bigger game of chess, and his face remained blank. At last, Dr. Rogoff had finished. There was silence while they waited. "It has risks," said the General Secretary quietly. He turned to General Marchenko. "Would it work?" he asked. Marchenko took a deep breath and nodded. "It is feasible," he agreed. "I believe it would take from 10 to 16 months to put into operation." "Comrade Colonel," asked the General Secretary of Philby. Philby's stutter increased as he spoke. "As to the risks, I am not best able to judge them, nor the question of technical feasibility. As to effect, it would, beyond any doubt, swing over 10% of the British floating vote into a hasty decision to vote Labour." "Comrade Professor Krilov." "I have to oppose it, Comrade General Secretary. I regard it as extremely hazardous. It is completely contrary to the terms of the Fourth Protocol. If that is ever breached, we may all suffer." The General Secretary seemed lost in meditation, which no one was about to disturb. The hooded eyes brooded behind the glittering glasses for 5 minutes. At length he raised his head. "Gather up the files and folders and pass them to me," said the General Secretary. When this was done, he went on, using his habitual monotone. "It is reckless, crazy, adventurous, and dangerous beyond belief," he intoned. "The committee is disbanded. You are to return to your professions and never mention either the Albion Committee or Plan Aurora again." The 4 subdued and humbled men put on their coats and hats in silence, hardly meeting each other's eyes, and were led to their cars downstairs. In the hollow courtyard they each climbed into their own car. In his personal Volga, Philby waited for the driver to start the engine, but the man just sat there. The other 3 limousines swept out of the square, under the arch, and into the boulevard. There was a tap on Philby's window. He wound it down to see the face of Major Pavlov. "Would you come with me, please, Comrade Colonel?" Philby's heart sank. He followed Major Pavlov back into the building. 2 minutes later he was shown back into the General Secretary's sitting room. The old man gestured Philby to a seat. In trepidation the British traitor took it. "What do you really think of it?" asked the General Secretary softly. Philby swallowed hard. "Ingenious, audacious, hazardous, but if it worked, effective." "It's brilliant," murmured the General Secretary. "And it is going ahead, but under my personal auspices. This is to be no one else's operation, just mine, and you will be closely involved in it. You will take up residence in the guest suite at my Dachau in Yusova. There you will put together the team that will undertake Plan Aurora." He pressed a buzzer under the table. "You will work at all times under the eye of this man. I believe you already know him." The door had opened. In it stood the impassive, cold visage of Major Pavlov. "He is highly intelligent and extremely suspicious," said the General Secretary with approval. "He is also totally loyal. He happens to be my nephew. And by the way, you will not have General Marchenko's 10 to 16 months. It appears Mrs. Thatcher is going to call an election in June. We must make ours 1 week before that." Philby let out his breath slowly. In 1916 it had taken 10 days to complete the Russian Revolution. Britain's greatest turncoat of them all was being given just 90 days to guarantee the British one. The willing cooperation of the South African Intelligence Service enabled Preston within 7 days to complete his inquiries into the case of Jan Marias. He reported his findings to General Panner, the head of the South African Intelligence Service. He reached into his pocket and produced a photograph which he laid on General Panner's desk. "That is a picture, the last picture of the real Jan Marias. As you see, he was a useful cricketer in his boyhood. He was a bowler. If you look, you will see his fingers are gripping the ball in the manner of a spin bowler. You will also see he's left-handed. I spent a week studying the Jan Marias in London, at close range, through binoculars. In driving, smoking, eating, drinking, he is right-handed. General, you can do many things to a man to change him. You can change his hair, his speech, his face, his mannerisms. But you cannot turn a left-handed spin bowler into a right-handed one." General Panner stared down at the photograph. "So what have we got up there in London, Mr. Preston?" "General, you have got a dedicated communist agent who's worked inside the South African Foreign Service more than 40 years for the Soviet Union." General Panner lifted his eyes from the desk and gazed out across the valley to the Voortrekker monument. "I'll break him," he whispered. "I'll break him into tiny pieces and stamp them into the bushveld." Preston coughed. "Bearing in mind that we also have a problem because of this man, could I ask you to restrain your hand until you've talked personally to Sir Nigel Irving?" "Very well, Mr. Preston." General Panner nodded. "I will talk to Sir Nigel first. Now, what are your plans?" "There is a flight back to London this evening, sir. I would like to be on it." General Panner rose and held out his hand. "Good day, Mr. Preston. Captain Viljoen will see you on the plane. And thank you for your assistance." Sir Bernard Hemmings, with Brian Harcourt Smith by his side, sat in silence and listened to Preston's report until he'd finished.
"Good God,"
he said heavily when Preston was silent.
"So it was Moscow after all. There'll be the devil to pay. The damage must have been huge. Brian, are both men still under surveillance?"
"Yes, Sir Bernard."
"We'll keep it that way through the weekend. Make no move to close in until the Paragon Committee have had a chance to read John's report."
"So, you are Major Petrovsky?" "Yes, Comrade Colonel," he said. Philby had read the file until he knew it perfectly. Petrovsky was still only 36 and had been trained for a decade to pass for an Englishman. He had twice been in Britain on familiarization trips, each time living under deep cover, each time going nowhere near the Soviet embassy, and neither time undertaking any mission at all. Philby knew the young man in front of him not only spoke perfect English, but was tone-perfect in 4 regional accents. "Sit down," he said. "Now, I am simply going to describe to you the broad outlines of the mission." It took 2 hours for Philby to outline the plan called Aurora, and what it involved. Petrovsky drank in the details. He was excited and amazed by the audacity of it. "You will spend the next few days with a team of 4 men only. They will brief you on a whole range of names, places, dates, transmission times, rendezvous and backup rendezvous.
You will memorize them all. The only thing you will have to take in with you will be a block of one-time pads. Well, that's it."
Petrovsky sat nodding at what he'd been told. "I have told the Comrade General Secretary I shall not fail," he said. "It will be done as required and on time. If the components arrive, it will be done." John Preston was at Charles Street for a meeting with Brian Harcourt Smith. The Deputy Director General was in his most eager-to-please mood. "Well, John, I gather congratulations are in order. The committee was most impressed by your revelations from South Africa." "Thanks, Brian." "Yes, indeed. It'll all be handled by the committee from now on. Now, to the future." "The future?" "You see, I'm in a bit of a dilemma. You've been on this case for 8 weeks. During all this time, young March, your number 2, has been running C1A and doing very well into the bargain. Now, I ask myself, what am I supposed to do with him? I don't think it would be quite fair to bang him back to the 2 slot. After all, he's made some extremely useful suggestions and a couple of very positive changes." He would, thought Preston. March was a young, eager beaver, very much one of Harcourt Smith's protégés. "Anyway, I know you've only been at C1A for 10 weeks, and that's pretty short, but seeing as you've covered yourself in glory, it might be a well-judged moment to move on. I've had a word with personnel, and as luck would have it, Cranley at C5C is taking early retirement at the end of the week. I thought it would suit you." Preston pondered. C5C. "Ports and airports?" he queried. Harcourt Smith raised an admonitory finger. "It's important, John. The special responsibility, of course, is to keep a weather eye open for solve-block illegals and couriers and so forth. It gets one out and about, sort of thing you like, and away from head office while the struggle for the succession goes on," thought Preston. He thought of protesting, of demanding a meeting with Sir Bernard to put his case for staying where he was. "Anyway, I want you to give it a try," said Harcourt Smith. Preston knew he was outmaneuvered. Harcourt Smith had spent half a lifetime working the head office system. At least, Preston thought, he could be a field man again, even if it was what he termed another policeman's job. "I'll expect you to start on Monday morning, then," said Harcourt Smith. On the Friday, Major Valery Petrovsky slipped quietly into Britain via Zurich and Dublin. He was an Englishman returning home from a one-day business trip to Dublin. There are no passport checks between Dublin and London. At the London end, arriving passengers must produce their boarding pass or ticket stub as identification. They also pass 2 blank-eyed special branchmen who affect to see nothing and miss very, very little. Neither had ever seen Petrovsky's face, because he'd never entered Britain by Heathrow Airport before. Had they asked, he could have produced a perfect British passport. In the name of James Duncan Ross. Passing through customs without a check, the Russian took a taxi to King's Cross Station. There he went to a left luggage locker. He already had the key. From the locker the Russian produced a package, sealed exactly as it had arrived in the diplomatic bag at the embassy 2 days earlier. The package Petrovsky slipped unopened into his grip. From King's Cross he took another taxi across London to Liverpool Street Station, and there boarded the early evening train for Ipswich in the county of Suffolk. Just in time for dinner, he checked into the Great White Horse Hotel. Had any curious policeman insisted on looking inside the package stowed in the hand grip of the young Englishman on the Ipswich train, he would have been amazed. In part it contained a Finnish Seiko automatic pistol with a full magazine, and the nose cone of each round carefully cut in the form of an X. The cuts had been filled with a mixture of gelatine and potassium cyanide concentrate. The other part of the contents consisted of the rest of the legend of James Duncan Ross. A legend is the fictitious life story of a non-existent man, supported by a host of perfectly real documents of every kind and description. This was what Petrovsky carried in his head and hand grip. He was, and could prove he was, James Ross, moving from the West Country to take over the East Anglian representation of a Swiss-based corporation marketing computer software. He had a handsome bank balance at Barclays Bank, Dorchester, Dorset, which he was about to transfer to Colchester. he had mastered the scrawled Ross signature to perfection. Valery Alexeyevich Petrovsky was perfectly confident as he dined that night in Ipswich, and rightly so, that no one would doubt he was James Duncan Ross. After dinner, he sought from the reception desk the Yellow Pages commercial directory and turned to the section for estate agents. While Major Petrovsky was dining of the Great White Horse in Ipswich, Sir Nigel opened his case and carefully laid 10 photocopies on a glass-topped coffee table in Berenson's apartment.
"I think you might, with advantage, have a look at these."
Berenson silently studied the top copy, lifted it to look at the one underneath, and then the third. At the third sheet he stopped and put them down. He'd gone very pale, but was still in control of himself. "I don't suppose there's anything I can say."
"Not much,"
said Sir Nigel calmly.
"They were returned to us some time ago. We kept you under surveillance for some weeks, watched the abstraction of the Ascension Island paper, the passing of it to Benotti, and thence to Marias. It's pretty well tied up, you know."
Berenson drew a deep breath. "I take the view, and have done for years, that the only struggle on this planet worth a light is the one against communism and Soviet imperialism. In that struggle, South Africa forms one of the bastions. For a long time I have thought it self-defeating for the Western powers on dubious moral grounds to treat South Africa as a leper, to deprive her of any share in our joint planning to respond to the Soviet threat on a global scale." Sir Nigel produced from his case the report Preston had brought back from Pretoria, the photograph of the boy Marias clipped to the top. With a shrug, Berenson began to read the 7 foolscap pages. At one point he sucked in his breath sharply. When he turned the last page, he put both hands up to cover his face and rocked slowly back and forth. "Oh, my God," he breathed. "What have I done?"
"Hell of a lot of damage, actually,"
said Sir Nigel. He let Berenson absorb the full measure of his misery without interruption. Berenson was no longer pale. He was ashen grey. When he took his hand from his face, he'd aged by many years. "Is there anything at all that I can do?" Sir Nigel shrugged, as if there was little enough that anyone could do. Then he said,
3 things, actually. 1, you continue going to the ministry as if nothing had happened, maintain the usual routine. 2, you help us with the damage assessment. The only possible way to mitigate the damage already done is for us to know everything, every single thing that went to Moscow. You withhold 1 dot or comma, and it'll be porridge and mail bags until you croak."
Yes, of course. That I can do. I recall every single document that was passed over. Everything. You said 3 things.
"Yes. The third is tricky. You maintain relations with Marias."
"I what?"
"You don't have to see him. I'd prefer you didn't. Just the usual contact through coded phone calls when you want to make a delivery."
"A delivery of what?"
"Material that my people will prepare for you. Disinformation, if you like. Do some real damage to the Soviets."
Berenson grasped as a drowning man at a straw. 5 minutes later Sir Nigel rose. He let himself out. As he walked down the corridor to the lift, he was quietly satisfied. He thought of the broken and terrified man he'd left behind him.
"From now on, you bastard, you work for me," he thought.
Petrovsky had arranged to rent a furnished house, number 12 Cherry Trees Close. It was a small, neat brick house in a small, neat brick road in a small, neat brick private sector housing estate in Ipswich. His next move was to rent a small and modest saloon car in Colchester. The next problem was going to be harder and would need the services of an insurance broker. He located and visited such a broker in the same town and explained his position. He had worked abroad for some years and prior to that had always driven a company car. As such, he had no regular insurance company in Britain. Now he had decided to return home and start up on his own account. He would need to purchase a vehicle, and for that would need insurance cover. Could the broker assist him? The broker would be delighted. What sort of vehicle did he intend to buy? A motorcycle. Yes, indeed. So much easier in dense traffic. Of course, in the hands of teenagers, these were difficult to insure, but a mature professional man, no problem. Comprehensive would be a bit difficult. Perhaps the client would settle for third party only. And the address? Staying at the Great White Horse in Ipswich. Perfectly acceptable. Then if Mr. Ross would inform him of the registration number of his motorcycle when he made the purchase, and any change of address, he was sure he could secure third-party insurance cover in 1 or 2 days. Petrovsky returned in his rented car to the estate agents in Ipswich to sign the lease and complete the formalities. The following day, Petrovsky found what he was looking for. Operating on a policy of making different purchases in different towns, he had gone to Stowmarket. The motorcycle was a BMW, not new but in excellent condition, a big, powerful machine, 3 years old but with only 22,000 miles on the clock. The same shop also stocked the accessories: black leather trousers and jacket, gauntlets, zip-sided jack boots and crash helmets with dark slide-down visors. He bought a complete outfit. From Stowmarket, Petrovsky motored north to Thetford. He found what he wanted just after lunch. In Magdalen Street is a recessed, rectangular yard containing 31 lock-up garages. One had a "To Let" notice stuck on its door. He traced the owner, who lived locally, rented the garage for 3 months, paying in cash, and was given the key. The garage was small and musty, but would serve his purpose admirably. He hung up his motorcycle leathers, helmet and boots, and during what remained of the afternoon bought 2 10-gallon plastic drums from 2 different shops, filled them with petrol at 2 different garages, and stored them in his lock-up. At sundown, he motored back to Ipswich, telling the hotel receptionist that he would check out the following morning. Next day, Petrovsky left the hotel, his luggage by now increased by a large suitcase full of clothes that he'd bought locally. He rang the insurance broker in Colchester to learn that the temporary cover note for the motorcycle had been issued. The Russian asked the broker not to mail it, he would collect it himself. This he did immediately, and late that afternoon moved into number 12 Cherry Haze. He spent part of the night working carefully with his one-time pads, preparing a coded message that no computer would break. On the Saturday morning he drove to Thetford, garaged his car, and took a local taxi to Stowmarket. Here, with a certified cheque, he paid the balance on the price of the BMW, borrowed the toilet to change into his leathers and crash helmet, which he'd bought in a canvas grip, stuffed the grip and his ordinary jacket, trousers and shoes into the panniers, and rode away. It was a long ride, and took him many hours. It was not until late evening that he arrived back at Thetford, changed clothes, exchanged motorcycle for family saloon, and motored sedately back to Cherry Haze Close, Ipswich, arriving at midnight. He was not observed, but had he been, it would have been as that nice young Mr. Ross who'd moved into number 12 on Friday. On Sunday afternoon, the regular Aeroflot service from Moscow came into London's Heathrow Airport just after 5. As with all Aeroflot crews, there was one member who worked for 2 masters, the Soviet State Airline and the KGB. The whole crew closed the aircraft down and left it in the hands of the ground staff for the night. As usual, they went through the flight crew entry procedures, and customs gave a cursory check of their shoulder bags and grips. Several had their own portable transistor radios, and no one took any notice of Romanov's Sony model on its shoulder strap. After clearing immigration and customs formalities, the whole crew boarded their minibus for the Green Park Hotel, where Aeroflot crews often stay. Whoever had given Romanov that transistor radio in Moscow just 3 hours before takeoff must have known that Aeroflot crews are hardly ever shadowed at Heathrow. When he got to his bedroom, Romanov could not help looking at the radio with curiosity. Then he shrugged, locked it in his case, and went down to the bar to join the other officers in a drink. He knew exactly what to do with it after breakfast the next day. The Aeroflot crew had a leisurely breakfast, and at 9:29 First Officer Romanov checked his watch and went to the men's toilets. He had been there before, and ascertained the cubicle he was to take. It was the second from the end. The one at the end already had its door closed and locked. He went into the adjacent one, and locked the door. At 9:30 he placed a small card on which he'd written the prescribed 6 figures on the floor next to the partition. A hand came under the partition, withdrew the card, wrote something on it, and placed it back on the floor. Romanov picked it up. On the reverse side were the 6 figures he had been expecting. With identification established, he placed the transistor on the floor, and the same hand drew it silently into the next-door cubicle. The next morning, 8th of April, the academic Komarov moved quietly past Greenock and into the Clyde, bound upriver for the port of Glasgow. She stopped briefly at Greenock to pick up the pilot and 2 custom officers. They had the usual glass in the captain's cabin and ascertained that she was out of Leningrad and in ballast to pick up a cargo of heavy-duty pump accessories from Weir of Cathcart Limited. The customs men checked the crew list, but did not memorize any particular name. Later it would be established that deckhand Konstantin Semyonov was on the list. At midnight, deckhand Semyonov walked down the gangplank, followed the quay for 100 yards, and turned up Finiston Street. He was unremarkable, dressed in scuffed shoes, cord trousers, a roll-neck sweater, and anorak. Under one arm he clutched a canvas gunny sack held closed by a drawstring. He reached Argyle Street, turned left, and followed it to Partick Cross. He consulted no map, but headed on into Hindland Road. A mile further on, he reached another major artery, the Great Western Road. He had memorized his route days before. He checked his watch here. It told him he still had half an hour, and the rendezvous could not be more than 10 minutes' walk ahead. He was almost at the bus stop at the junction of the Great Western and Hughenden roads when he saw them. They were lounging about in the passenger shelter of the bus stop. It was 1:30 in the morning, and there were 5 of them. They blocked the pavement, so he stepped into the road. One of them grabbed his arm and shouted at him. What the lout actually said was, "What you got in your wee sack, then?" But he could not understand, so he shook his head and tried to walk past. Then they were on him, and he went down under a rain of blows. When he was in the gutter, the kicking started. He dimly felt hands tearing at his gunny sack, so he clutched it to his belly with both hands and rolled over, taking the blows around the head and kidneys. Mrs. Sylvester, old, widowed, alone and riddled with arthritis, was unable to sleep. She heard the shouts from the street below and hobbled from her bed to the window. What she saw caused her to limp across the room to the telephone, where she dialed 999 and asked for the... Sister gave him the usual once-over. He was alive at any rate, and ordered the porters to put the man on the bench in one of the examination rooms. The one they chose was the room opposite the sister's cubicle. P.C. Craig, having ascertained his anonymous charge was still unconscious, on his back, across the corridor, took the man's anorak, entered her office, and placed both anorak and gunny sack on her table. "Who's Jimmy?" asked the ward sister, preparing 2 cups of tea. "Looks like a seaman, and a Russian at that," said Craig, perturbed. To try to discover what ship the man could be off, Craig emptied the gunny sack. It contained simply a rolled-up thick-knit jersey, wrapped round a circular screw-top tobacco tin. Inside the tin was not tobacco, but cotton wool, shrouding 2 discs of aluminium with between them another 2-inch diameter disc of a dull grey metal. Craig examined the 3 discs without interest, replaced them in their bed of cotton wool, screwed the tin shut again, and laid it on the table beside the paybook. What he did not know was that across the corridor the victim of the mugging attack had come to and was peering through the curtains at him. What he did know was that it was time to tell Division he had an injured Russian on his hands. "Use your phone, pet," he asked the sister. "Don't you pet me," called back the sister. P.C. Craig began to dial. Just what went through Konstantin Semyonov's mind will never be known. Dazed and confused, he could see the unmistakable black uniform of a British policeman with his back to him across the corridor. He could see his own paybook and the consignment he'd been told to bring to Britain and deliver to the agent sitting on the table by the policeman's hand. He had watched the officer examine the consignment. He personally had never dared open the tin, and now the man was phoning. The first thing P.C. Craig knew, he was roughly elbowed aside. A bare arm pushed past him, reached for the tin, and grabbed it. "What the hell? Jimmy!" he shouted. Then, assuming the poor fellow was hallucinating, he grabbed the man and tried to restrain him. The tin was shaken from the Russian's hand and fell to the floor. For a moment, Semyonov stared at the Scottish policeman, then panicked and ran. Still calling, "Hey, Jimmy, come back here!" P.C. Craig thundered down the corridor after him. Semyonov came through the mirrored doors in the public waiting room. To his left was a square lobby containing 2 lift doors. One door was closing upon an empty elevator. He threw himself through the gap just as the doors closed. As the lift rose, he heard the policeman banging impotently on it. He leaned back and closed his eyes in misery. P.C. Craig made for the stairwell and ran up. At every level, he checked the lights above the elevator doors. The lift was still climbing. At the top and 10th floor, he was hot, angry, and puffed out. Semyonov had got out at the 10th. There was a door, open and leading to stairs. He ran up to find himself in another corridor. At the far end was the last door, and in the warm, humid night it stood open. It led to the flat roof of the block. P.C. Craig had lost ground, but he made the final doorway eventually and stepped out into the night air. Adjusting his eyes to the darkness, he made out the figure of a man by the north parapet. He started to walk towards the figure, hands held out to show they were empty. "Come on, Jimmy, or Ivan, or whatever your name is. You're all right. You got a wee bang on the hair, that's all. Come on away down with me." The man watched him approach until he was 20 feet away. Then he looked down, took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and jumped. P.C. Craig could not believe it for several seconds, even after he heard the soggy smack of the body impacting 100 feet down into the staff car park. "Oh, Christ," he breathed. "Am I in bother?" With fumbling fingers, he reached for his personal radio and called up division. The silent figure in black motorcycle leathers checked his watch. 3 o'clock. The rendezvous had been for 2. 1 hour's delay was all that was allowed. There was a second backup rendezvous, different place, 24 hours later. He would be there. If the contact failed to show up, he would have to use the radio again. He rose and left. At noon, the phone rang in the office of C4C in Gordon. Bright took it, listened for a moment, and held it out to Preston. "It's for you. They won't talk to anyone else." "Who is it?" "The Scottish office, Edinburgh." Preston took the phone. "John Preston." "Yes. Good morning to you." He listened for several minutes, his brow furrowed. He noted the name Carmichael on a scratch pad. "Yes, I think I'd better come up." "Would you tell Inspector Carmichael I'll be on the 3 o'clock shuttle, and could he meet me at Glasgow Airport?" "Thank you." "Glasgow?" asked Bright. "What have they been up to?" "Oh, some Russian seaman who took a tumble off a roof and who may not have been all he should have been. I'll be back tomorrow. It's probably nothing. Still, anything to get out of the office." Preston's flight landed just after 4:30. At Glasgow Airport, the detective inspector of a special branch appeared and they introduced themselves. 5 minutes later they were in the inspector's car and pulling onto the motorway towards the darkening city. "I could be wrong, but there seems to me a possibility the man was not a merchant seaman," said Carmichael. "Go on." "Seamen in the port of Glasgow go to Betty's or the stable bar. This man was 4 miles from the docks, walking up a dual carriageway towards nowhere, long after closing hours, without a bar in sight. What the hell was he doing there at that hour?" "Good question," said Preston. "What next?" "At 10 this morning I went to the post-mortem. The faces of merchant navy deckhands are weather-beaten, wind-burnt, browned and lined. This man had a bland, pale face. Then his hands, they were soft and white, like those of a desk worker." Preston nodded approvingly. Carmichael was sharp. "I'd like copies of the various statements, and a list of the man's effects. By the way, where are they?" "Locked up at Partick police station. Just go and have a look if you like." Preston flew back from Glasgow, collected his car from the short-term park and headed for the M4 motorway. 30 minutes brought him to his destination, an institution on the outskirts of the village of Aldermaston. A scientist, Dr. David Wynne Evans, was waiting for him in the hallway. "Well, well, Mr. Preston, what can I do for you?" Preston dug into his pocket, produced a handkerchief, and held it out to show the 3 discs it contained. "These were taken off somebody in Glasgow," he said. "They defeat me. I'd like to know what they are and what they could be used for." The doctor looked at them closely. "Nefarious purposes, you think?" "Could be." "Difficult to say without tests," said the metallurgist. "Can I run them through some tests on Monday and call you?" "Monday will do fine," said Preston. "I'm taking a few days off, actually. I'll be at home. Can I give you my number in Kensington?" Dr. Wynne Evans hurried upstairs and locked the discs in his safe for the night. Preston drove back to London. While he was driving, the listening station at Menwith Hill in Yorkshire picked up a single squirt from a clandestine transmitter. It was somewhere in the hills north of Sheffield. When the Sheffield police got there, the spot turned out to be a lay-by on a lonely road between Barnsley and Pontefract. There was no one there. "Keep after him," said the director of DCHQ Cheltenham. "We haven't had a sleeper transmitter go suddenly active in ages. I wonder what he's saying." What Major Valery Petrovsky had been saying, although transmitted by his operator when he was long gone, was, "Courier 2 never showed. Inform soonest rearrival substitute." The phone call on the Monday morning caught John Preston just as he was about to leave home. "Mr. Preston? David Wynne Evans here. I've had a look at your little piece of metal. Very interesting. Can you come out here and have a chat with me?" "Well, actually, I'm taking a few days off," said Preston. "But the end of the week suit. I think it might be better before then, if you could spare the time." "Well, could I come by this afternoon, say, about 5? 5 it is," said the scientist. "Ask for me at the desk. I'll have you shown up." Preston swung into the main gate at Aldermaston, found a slot in the visitors' car park, and got out. He presented himself to the 2 men on the desk. They examined his ID card and rang Dr. Wynne Evans, who sanctioned the visit to his office. The scientist regarded him over his glasses. "May I ask you where you got this little exhibit?" he inquired, pointing to the heavy lead-like disc of metal which now sat in a sealed glass jar. "It was taken off somebody in Glasgow during the small hours of Thursday morning." "What about the other 2 discs?" "Oh, they're just ordinary aluminium, boy. Nothing strange about them. Just used to keep this one safe and sound. This is the one that interests me." "Do you know what it is?" asked Preston. "Of course I know what it is," he said. "It's my job to know what it is. It's a disc of pure polonium." Preston frowned. "I've never heard of polonium." "No, well, you probably wouldn't have," said Dr. Wynne Evans. "I mean, you don't find it hanging about on your workbench. It's very rare." "And what are its uses, Doctor?" "Well, it is occasionally, only very occasionally, mind, used in curative medicine. Was your man in Glasgow on his way to a medical conference or exhibition?" "No," said Preston firmly. He was in no way heading for a medical conference. "Well, I'm afraid that leaves a 90% likelihood. A disc of polonium this size will do nothing on its own, but in close juxtaposition with a disc of another metal, called lithium, the 2 combine to form an initiator." "A what?" "An initiator." "And what, pray, the hell is that?" "An initiator, my dear man, is a sort of detonator for a bomb," said Dr. Wynne Evans. "Oh," said Preston. He felt somewhat deflated. There had been bombs in Britain before. Nasty, but local. He'd seen quite a few in Ireland. This, initiator of polonium and lithium, would it be used in an anti-personnel bomb?" he asked. "Oh, yes, you could say so, boy," replied the Welshman. "An initiator, you see, is what sets off a nuke." The existence of the secret plan Aurora had reached the ears of a very powerful man, General Karpov, the head of the KGB. By methods characteristic of the KGB, he persuaded Professor Krilov to give him details. The professor told him that the object was to ensure a Labour victory at the British general election, then to replace Kinnock with a Marxist-Leninist premier, who would carry out unilateral disarmament and the expulsion of all American forces. The professor stated that he had opposed the plan and that the General Secretary had agreed with him. "Tell me," said Karpov, "why did you oppose it?" "It seemed to me reckless and dangerous. Apart from anything, it was in complete contravention of the Fourth Protocol. If that protocol is ever breached, God knows where the world will end up." "The Fourth Protocol?" asked Karpov. "On the 1st of July, 1968, said Professor Krilov, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed between the three then nuclear powers of the world, the USA, Great Britain, and the USSR. In the treaty, the three signatory nations pledged themselves not to impart the technology or the material capable of enabling the construction of a nuclear weapon to any nation not then in possession of such technology or material. Do you recall that?" "Yes," said Karpov. "I remember that much." "Well, a complete absence of publicity surrounded the later signing of 4 secret protocols to that treaty." "What exactly did the 4th protocol envisage?" asked Karpov. Professor Krilov sighed. "The 4th protocol foresaw technological advances in the manufacture of nuclear bombs, mainly in the areas of miniaturization and simplification. The basic atomic bomb, which it once took a huge bomber to drop on Japan in 1945, can now be made small enough to go in a suitcase and simple enough to be assembled from a dozen prefabricated, milled and threaded components like a child's construction kit." "And that is what the 4th protocol banned?" asked Karpov. Professor Krilov shook his head. "It went further. It forbade any of the signatory nations to introduce onto the territory of any nation a device in assembled or unassembled form by covert means, for detonation in, say, a rented house or flat in the heart of a city." "And that was what Plan Aurora had in mind?" Krilov nodded. "Plan Aurora intended to infiltrate into Britain a top-class Soviet agent who would rent a provincial villa and become the executive officer of Aurora. To him, using a variety of couriers, would be smuggled the 10 or so component parts of a small atomic bomb of about 1.5 kiloton power. The device would have been detonated 6 days before polling day. The place was vitally important. The one selected was the United States Air Force Base at Bent Waters in Suffolk. The intent was not to cause an ecological catastrophe, but fear and a violent wave of hatred of America." Karpov nodded. "Yes, I believe it would have done that. Anything more?" "Much more," said Krilov glumly. "On the 4th day before polling, one of our friends, very close to Mr. Kinnock, would have urged the labor leader to fly to Moscow, see the General Secretary personally, and intervene for peace. Mr. Kinnock would then return to London with the stature of a global statesman. The events of the previous 6 days would have shattered the traditional alliance with America and swung 10%, the vital 10% of the British electorate to vote Labour into office. After that, the hard left would have taken over, and that, General, was Plan Aurora." Karpov rose. "You have been very kind, Professor, and very wise. Remain silent, and I shall also." Brian Harcourt Smith listened attentively, leaning back, eyes on the ceiling, fingers toying with a slim gold propelling pencil. "That's it?" he asked when Preston had finished his verbal report. "Yes," said Preston. "I think it inescapable that Deckhand Semyonov had arrived in Glasgow to deposit his tin and his contents in a dead drop, or handed over personally to someone he was due to meet. Either way, that means there is an illegal here in on the ground. I think we should try to find him. Charming idea. The trouble is, we haven't a clue where to start. Look, John, let me be frank. I really do not see how I can take this matter higher unless you can provide me with a little more evidence than a single disc of rare metal taken from a lamentably dead Russian seaman. It's been identified as one half of the initiator of a nuclear device. It's hardly just a bit of metal. Very well, one half of what might be the trigger of what might be a device, which might have been destined for a Soviet illegal who might be resident in Britain. Believe me, John, when you submit me your full report, I shall as ever consider it with the greatest gravity. And then mark it no further action? Asked Preston. Harcourt Smith's smile was unfaltering and dangerous. Not necessarily. Any report from you will be treated on its merits like anyone else's. Now, I suggest you try to find for me at least some corroborative evidence to support your evident predilection for the conspiracy theory. All right, said Preston as he rose. I'll get stuck into it. You do that, said Harcourt Smith. When Preston had gone, the Deputy Director General consulted a list of in-house numbers and called the head of personnel. John Preston was annoyed and not in the best of humours. The letter from Crichton in personnel was on his desk. He read it with something close to disbelief. It was couched as ever in the friendliest terms. A glance at the files had shown that Preston was owed 4 weeks' leave. He would be, of course, aware of the rules of the service. Backlogging of leave was not encouraged for obvious reasons. Necessity to keep all leave-taking up to date, blah, blah, blah. In short, he would be required to take up his backlog of leave forthwith, i.e., as of the following morning. He called personnel and insisted on speaking to Crichton personally. Tim, it's me, John Preston. Look, what's this letter doing on my desk? I can't take leave now. I'm on a case right in the middle of it. All you have to do is call Brian Harcourt Smith. He'll vouch for the importance of the case I'm on. I can take the leave in the summer. John, said Tim Crichton gently, that letter was written in the express orders of Brian. Preston stared at the handset for several minutes. I see, he said finally, and put it down. Where are you going? Asked Bright as he headed for the door. To get a stiff drink, said Preston. It was not until the small hours of the Thursday that Major Petrovsky arrived back at Cherry Hayes Close. The black leathers and visored mask were with the BMW in their garage at Thetford. When he drove his little Ford quietly onto the hard pad in front of his garage and let himself into the house, he was in a sober suit and light raincoat. No one noticed him, or the plastic carrier bag in his hand. With the door firmly locked behind him, he went upstairs and pulled open the bottom drawer of the clothes chest. Inside was a Sony transistor radio. Beside it, he laid the empty plaster cast. He did not interfere with either item. He didn't know what they contained, nor did he wish to find out. That would be for the assembler, who would not arrive to perform his task until the complete list of required components had been safely received. Petrovsky checked his mental list. Courier 4 was due in 4 days, and the meet was in the West End of London. A few days after the start of his enforced leave, Preston was surprised to receive from Sir Nigel, the head of MI6, an invitation to visit his flat. The flat was small and discreet, in a modern block off Chelsea Manor Street. Sir Nigel answered the door himself. "My dear John, how good of you to come." When they were seated in the small sitting room, Sir Nigel said, "It appears you are not too happy in your work at present." "I'm not in work at present, sir. I'm on compulsory leave." "So I gather. Something that happened in Glasgow, was it?" "Haven't you received a report on the Glasgow incident of last week? It concerned a Russian seaman, a man I believe to be a courier. Surely that involves 6. "Doubtless it will be on its way before long," said Sir Nigel carefully.
Would you be kind enough to tell me about it?
Preston started at the beginning and told the tale through to the end, so far as he knew it. Sir Nigel sat as if lost in thought, which he was, taking in every word with part of his mind, and calculating with the rest. They would not really try it, would they? He was thinking. Not breach the fourth protocol. Or would they? He noticed that Preston had stopped talking.
Do forgive me, he said. What do you deduce from it all?
I believe there was an intended recipient of that disc of polonium, either directly through a rendezvous or by dead drop. That means he's here on the ground. I think we should try to find him. Sir Nigel pursed his lips.
If he's a top illegal, finding him would be a needle in a haystack affair, he murmured.
Yes, I know that.
So, if you had not been sent on compulsory leave, what would you have sought authority to do?
I think, Sir Nigel, that one disc of polonium is no use to anybody. Whatever the illegal is up to, there must be other components. Some may have already arrived. On the law of averages, there must be more yet to come. And apparently they are coming in via mules or couriers who pose as harmless seamen or God knows what else besides.
And you would want to do what?
Asked Sir Nigel. Preston took a deep breath. I would have wanted, he stressed the conditional aspect, to check back on all entrants from the Soviet Union over the past 40, 50, even 100 days.
And you think now that you won't get the chance?
Preston shook his head. Even if I was allowed back to work tomorrow, I'm pretty certain I would be off the case. Apparently, I'm an alarmist and I make waves. Sir Nigel nodded pensively.
Poaching between the services is not regarded as terribly good form,
he said, as if thinking out loud.
On the other hand, I take a view, shared by yourself, that there might be more to this iceberg than the tip. In short, you have 3 weeks' leave. Would you be prepared to spend them working on this case?
For whom?
For me, said Sir Nigel. You couldn't come to Sentinel. You'd be seen. Word would get round.
Then work where?
Here. It's small but comfortable. Any incident involving a Soviet or Soft Bloc arrival would have been recorded, either on paper or in a computer. I can arrange for the files and the printout to be brought to you. What do you say?
If Charles Street finds out I'm finished at 5.
Or how much longer do you think you've got at Charles Street under its present management?
Preston laughed shortly. Not long, he said. All right, sir, I'll do it. I want to stay on this case. There's something buried in there somewhere. Sir Nigel nodded approvingly.
You're a tenacious man, John. I like tenacity. Usually yields results. Be here on Monday at 9. I'll have 2 of my lads waiting for you. Ask them for whatever you want, and you'll get it.
On the Monday morning, as Preston started work in the Chelsea flat, an internationally famous Czech concert pianist arrived at Heathrow Airport from Prague, en route to his Wigmore Hall concert the following evening. His retinue consisted of 3, his dresser, a female secretary, and his personal aide, a tall, lugubrious man called Lichka, who took care of negotiations with host organizations and finances, and seemed to live on a diet of antacid tablets. That Monday, Mr. Lichka was working his way through an abnormally large amount of his pills. He had not wanted to do what was required of him, but the men from the secret police had been extremely persuasive. The men had made plain his granddaughter's entry into university would be so much easier to arrange if he was prepared to help them. A polite way of saying the girl did not stand a chance of entering university if he failed them. When they had given him his shoes back, he could find no trace of interference, and according to instructions had worn them on the flight and straight through Heathrow Airport. That evening, at the precise hour he had been briefed to expect, there was a soft knock on Lichka's door. A piece of paper was pushed under it. He checked the identification code, opened the door 5 inches, and passed out a plastic bag containing his pair of shoes. Unseen hands took the bag and he closed the door. When he'd flushed the scrap of paper down the toilet pan, he sighed with relief. It had been easier than he expected. Before midnight, in a backwater of Ipswich, the shoes joined the plaster cast and the radio in a bottom drawer. Courier 4 had delivered. On the downs above the small Sussex port of Newhaven, a man gazed at the tossing waves of the English Channel. He was dressed in black motorcycle leathers, his helmet on the seat of his parked BMW motorcycle. He was watching the approach of a ferry, well over the horizon and beating her way towards the shelter of the harbour mole. The ferry would arrive from Dieppe in 30 minutes. Somewhere on board should be Courier 5. Anton Zalewski, his passport said, and it was perfectly accurate. Customs examined his suitcase and his bag with the duty-free allowance bought on board the ship. His bottle of gin and his 25 cigars in an unopened box were within the permitted limit. The customs officer nodded him through. Zalewski had indeed bought a box of 25 good cigars in the duty-free shop. He then retired to a lavatory, locked himself in, and eased the identifying duty-free labels off the newly bought box, only to stick those labels on an identical box he'd brought with him. The ones from the duty-free shop went overboard to a waiting sea. In the train to London, he sought out the first-class carriage from the engine and waited. Just before Lewes, the door opened and a man in black leather stood there. "Does this train go straight to London?" he asked. "I believe it also stops at Lewes," Zalewski replied. The man held out his hand. Zalewski passed him the flat box of cigars. The man stuffed it down his jacket front, zipped up, nodded, and left. When the train started out of Lewes, Zalewski saw the man once again on the downline platform going back to Newhaven. Before midnight, the cigars joined the radio, plaster case, and shoes in Ipswich. Courier 5 had delivered. John Preston had been due back at work in Gordon Street on the 13th of May.
"I know it's frustrating, but I'd like you to stay on," said Sir Nigel Irvine on one of his visits. "You'll have to call in with a bad dose of flu. If you need a doctor's kit, let me know. I have a couple who'll oblige."
By the 16th, Preston knew he was up a blind alley. Without a major national alert, customs and immigrations had done all they could. The sheer volume of human traffic prevented the intensive searching of every visitor. It was 5 weeks since the Russian seaman had been mugged in Glasgow, and he was convinced he'd missed the rest of the couriers. Perhaps they'd all been in the country before Semyonov, and the deckhand had been the last. Perhaps. With growing desperation, he realized he did not know if he had a deadline at all, or if he did, when it was. "One break," said Preston angrily. "All I need is one small break." John Preston got his break on the following Monday afternoon. Just after 4, an airliner of Austrian Airlines came into Heathrow from Vienna. One of the travellers aboard offered a perfectly authentic Austrian passport, announcing its bearer to be one Franz Winkler. The immigration officer examined the familiar green plastic-covered Reich pass. It was of current issue and had a valid UK visa. Beneath his desk, the officer's left hand tapped out the passport number. He glanced at the display screen, closed the passport, and handed it back with a brief smile. "Thank you, sir. Next, please." As Herr Winkler picked up his hand grip and moved through, the officer raised his eyes towards a small window facing him 20 feet away. At the same time, his right foot pressed an alert button near the floor. From the office window, one of the resident special branch men caught his gaze. The immigration man looked in the direction of Herr Winkler's back and nodded. The face of the special branch detective withdrew from the window, and seconds later he and a colleague were slipping quietly after the Austrian. In the concourse, he spent some time at the Midland Bank changing travellers' checks into sterling currency, during which time one of the special branch men got a good picture of him from an upper balcony. When the Austrian took a cab from the rank in front of number 2 building, the special branch officers piled into their own unmarked saloon and were right behind him. Winkler took his cab as far as Bayswater and paid it off at the junction of Edgware Road and Sussex Gardens. Then he walked, grip in hand, down Sussex Gardens until he came to a boarding house with a vacancies notice in the window and went in. He must have got a room, because he did not emerge. It was 1 hour after Winkler's cab had left Heathrow, and at that time the phone rang in Preston's Chelsea flat. His contact man at Sentinel, the one ordered by Sir Nigel to liaise with Preston, was on the line. "There's a Joe that's just come in at Heathrow," said the MI6 man. "Maybe nothing, but his passport number came up little red lights on the computer. Name of Franz Winkler, Austrian, off the Vienna flight." "They didn't pick him up, I hope," said Preston. "No, according to our standing request, they tailed him. Hold on. They just housed him at a small bed and breakfast hotel in Paddington." Preston arranged for a standby team of watchers to head for Sussex Gardens in Paddington. They happened to be led by Harry Birkinshaw. Preston paced his small apartment in a rage of frustration. He wanted to be out on the streets, or at least at the centre of the operation. By 7 that evening, Harry Birkinshaw's men had moved in, taking over the watch from the special branch men who happily went off duty. It was a warm and pleasant evening. The watchers waited for Winkler to make contact. The trouble was, he did not. He did nothing. He just sat in his hotel room behind the net curtains and lay low. At 8:30 he came out, walked to a restaurant on Edgware Road, had a simple supper and went back again. He made no drop, picked up no instructions, left nothing at his table, spoke to no one in the street. But he did do 2 things of interest. He stopped sharply in Edgware Road on his way to the restaurant, stared in a plate-glass window for several seconds, then headed back the way he'd come. It's one of the oldest tricks for trying to spot a tail, and not a very good one. "He's bent all right," Birkinshaw said. "His surveillance conscious are not very good." Birkinshaw's judgment reached Preston in his Chelsea hideout. He nodded in relief. It was beginning to look better. After his gyrations on Edgware Road, Winkler returned to his boarding house and spent the rest of the night inside. Meanwhile, the photos of Winkler taken by the special branch men in Heathrow Airport, backed by others taken on the street in Bayswater, had been developed and placed reverentially before the gaze of the legendary Miss Blodwin. It is the almost hilarious case, but perfectly true, that while Britain's CIA cousins use banks of computers stored with millions and millions of facial features to try to match up the incoming daily flow of photographs, Britain uses Blodwin, an elderly and often ill-used lady, forever harassed by her younger male colleagues for a quick make. Blodwin has been in the job 40 years and works underneath Sentinel House, where she presides over the huge archive of pictures that make up MI6's mug book. That night, while Bayswater slept and Birkinshaw's men hugged the shadows, Blodwin sat and stared at the face of Franz Winkler. After an hour, she simply said, "Far East," and went along the rows of her albums. She had her make in the small hours of Tuesday, the 26th of May. It wasn't a good photograph, and it was 5 years old. The hair was darker then, the waist slimmer. He was at a reception at the Indian Embassy, standing beside his own ambassador, smiling deferentially. One of the younger men stared at the 2 photographs doubtfully. "Are you sure, Blodwin?" If looks could cripple, he would have needed to invest in a wheelchair. He backed away hastily and made for a telephone. "There's a make," he said. "He's a Czech. 5 years ago, he was a low-level gopher in the Czech embassy in Tokyo. Name, Yuri Hayek." Preston was woken by the telephone at 3 in the morning. He listened, thanked the caller, and replaced the phone. He smiled happily. "Gotcha," he said. At 10 in the morning, Winkler was still inside his hotel. At 11, he emerged from the boarding house, walked to Edgware Road again, hailed a cab, and set off towards Park Lane. At Hyde Park Corner, the cab, tailed by 2 cars containing the watcher team, went down Piccadilly. Winkler dismissed it in Piccadilly and tried another few basic manoeuvres to throw off a tail he had not even spotted. Satisfied he had no tail, Winkler entered the British Rail Travel Centre in Lower Regent Street. There he inquired the times of trains to Sheffield. The scarfed Scottish football fan standing a few feet away and trying to get back to Motherwell was one of the watchers. Winkler paid cash for a second-class return ticket to Sheffield, noted that the last train of the night was out of St Pancras station at 9:25, thanked the rail clerk and left. He had lunch at a cafe nearby, returned to Sussex Gardens and stayed there all afternoon. Preston received the news about the train ticket to Sheffield just after 1. At 7 that evening, he left the Chelsea apartment for the last time. He was out in the open again and loved it. At Sussex Gardens, he slipped up behind Harry Birkinshaw. "Hello, Harry." "Good Lord, John Preston, what are you doing here?" "Taking a breath of air." "Well, don't make yourself visible. We've got a Joe holed up in there across the road." "I know. I gather he's due to leave for Sheffield on the 9:25. At 8:30, Winkler left the hotel. He was carrying his grip. He hailed a passing cab and gave his instructions to the driver. As he stepped out of the doorway, Birkinshaw called in his team and his 2 cars. He jumped in the first one and they were 100 yards behind the cab across Edgware Road. Preston was in the second car. 10 minutes later they knew they were heading east, towards the station. Winkler paid off his cab on the forecourt of the station, headed through the single-brick archway into the vaulted dome of the Victorian railway station, and consulted the departure board. Around him the 4 watchers and Preston vaporized into the throng of passengers in the brick and cast-iron concourse. The 9:25 was at platform 2, calling at Leicester, Derby, Chesterfield and Sheffield. Having found his train, Winkler walked up the length of it, past 3 first-class carriages, the buffet car, to the 3 blue upholstered second-class carriages near the front end. He selected the middle one, hefted his grip onto the rack, and sat quietly, awaiting the departure. It was an open-plan carriage, and after a few minutes a young black man with earphones over his head and a Walkman music player clipped onto his belt came in and sat 3 rows away. One of Birkinshaw's team took the front carriage, Harry and John Preston the third, so that Winkler was boxed, and the 4th man took a first-class seat at the rear in case Winkler did a runner down the train to shake off what he thought was a tail. At 9:25 on the dot, the Intercity 125 hissed out of St Pancras and headed north. The train was almost empty. 2 carriages instead of 6 would have amply accommodated the 60 passengers on board. Ginger, the young black with the headphones who was with Winkler in the second carriage, had 5 others in there with him. There were a dozen sharing 60 seats with Preston and Birkinshaw in the third. For an hour and a quarter Winkler did nothing. He had no reading matter. He just stared out of the window at the dark countryside beyond. At 10:45 the train slowed for Leicester and he moved. He took his grip off the rack, walked up the carriage, passed out to the toilet area and pulled down the window of the door giving onto the platform. Ginger informed the rest, who prepared to move at short notice if they had to. Another passenger pushed past Winkler as the train stopped. "Excuse, please, is this Sheffield?" Winkler asked. "No, it's Leicester," the man said, and descended to the platform. "Ah, so. Thank you," said Winkler. He put down his grip, but stayed at the open window looking up and down the platform during the brief stopover. As the train pulled out, he returned to his seat and put his grip back on the rack. At 11:43 they rolled into Chesterfield. This time Winkler left his grip where it was, but went to lean out of the window as 2 or 3 passengers quit the train and hurried through the ticket barrier. The platform was empty before the train began to roll. When it did, Winkler snapped open the door, jumped to the moving concrete and slammed the door closed with a backward movement of one arm. Birkinshaw was very rarely caught off balance by a Joe, but he later admitted Winkler had got him cold. Winkler must have seen them and aborted his rendezvous, whatever it was. Preston and Birkinshaw ran forward to the boarding platform where they were joined by Ginger from the carriage in front. The window was still open. Preston stuck his head out and looked back. Winkler, satisfied at last that he had no tail, was striding briskly down the platform with his back to the train. "Harry, get back here with the team by car," shouted Preston. "Get me on the radio when you're in range. Ginger, close the door after me." He shoved the door open, stepped to the running board, dropped into the paratrooper's land position and jumped. The train was doing 30 when Preston slammed into the embankment. praying he would not hit a concrete post or large stone. He was lucky. The thick May grass took some of the shock, then he was rolling, knees together, elbows in, head down. Harry told him later he couldn't watch. Ginger said he was bouncing like a toy along the embankment and down towards the spinning wheels. When he finally stopped, he was lying in the gully between the grass and the permanent way. He hauled himself to his feet, turned, and began to jog back towards the lights of the station. When he appeared at the ticket barrier, the guard was closing for the night. He looked at the grazed apparition in the torn coat with amazement. "The last man through here," said Preston. "Short, stocky, grey Macintosh. Where did he go?" The guard nodded towards the forecourt, and Preston ran. Too late, the guard realized he'd not collected the ticket. In the forecourt, Preston saw the tail lights of a taxi sweeping out of the yard and towards the town. It was the last taxi. A few feet away, a railway porter was kick-starting his moped. "I need to borrow your bike," said Preston. "Bug off," said the porter. There was no time for identification or argument. The lights of the taxi were passing under the new ring road and out of sight. So Preston hit him, just once, on the jaw. The porter crashed over. Preston caught the falling moped, jerked it free of the man's legs, straddled it, and rode off. He was lucky with the traffic light. When the taxi rolled down Holywell Street and into Saltergate, he was 100 yards behind. Then he lost more ground as the bigger engine outpaced him for the straight half-mile of that highway. If Winkler had been taken out into the countryside due west of Chesterfield, Preston could never have caught him. Fortunately, the taxi's brake lights flashed on when it was a speck in the distance. Winkler was paying it off where Saltergate becomes Ashgate Road. As Preston closed the gap, he could see Winkler beside the car, looking up and down. There was no other traffic. Nothing for it but to keep going. He puttered past the halted taxi like a late home-goer about his business, swerved into Foljam Road and stopped. Winkler crossed the top of the road on foot. Preston followed. Winkler never looked back again. He just strolled round the boundary wall of Chesterfield football ground and into Compton Street. Here he approached a house and knocked on the door. Moving between patches of shadow, Preston had reached the corner of the street and was hidden behind a bush in the garden of the corner house. Up the street he saw lights come on in a darkened house, and the door opened. There was a brief conversation on the doorstep, and Winkler went inside. Preston sighed and settled behind his bush for a night-long vigil. At 2 in the morning he heard the faint noise on his communicator as Birkinshaw came back into range. He identified himself and gave his position. At 2:30 he heard the soft pad of footsteps and hissed to give his location. Birkinshaw joined him in the shrubbery. "You all right, John?" "Yes. He's housed up in there, second beyond the tree, with a light behind the curtain." "Where are the others?" "Down the street. We came back by taxi and dismissed it." "John, we've got no wheels. Also, come the dawn, this street's got no cover." "Put 2 at the top end and 2 down here," said Preston. "I'm going back into the town centre to find the police station and ask for a bit of backup. If Chummy leaves, tell me, but shadow him with 2 of the team. Keep 2 on that house." He left the garden and walked back into central Chesterfield looking for the police station. As he walked, a phrase kept repeating itself in his head. There was something about Winkler's performance that did not make sense. Superintendent Robin King was not pleased to be woken at 3 in the morning, but on hearing that there was an officer of MI5 from London at his police station seeking assistance, he agreed to come at once, and was there, unshaven and uncombed, 20 minutes later. He listened attentively while Preston explained the gist of the story. That a foreigner believed to be a Soviet agent had been tailed from London, had jumped train at Chesterfield, and had been followed to a house in Compton Street, number as yet unknown. "I do not yet know who lives in that house or why our suspect has visited it. I intend to find out, but for the moment I do not want an arrest. I have 4 men of our watcher service in that street, but come the daylight they'll stick out like sore thumbs. So I need some assistance now." "What exactly can I do for you, Mr. Preston?" the senior police officer asked. "Can we get hold of an unmarked van and park it in that street with my men inside, just as a temporary measure?" "One of our men has a van. It's pretty battered. He's always having his leg pulled about it. That should do." 30 minutes later, the sleepy police constable had made rendezvous with a watcher team outside the football stadium main entrance. Birkinshaw and his men piled inside, and the van was driven into Compton Street and parked opposite the suspect house. On instructions, the policeman climbed out, stretched, and walked away down the road, for all the world like a man coming home from night shift. From the rear windows, Birkinshaw peered out and came on the radio to Preston. "That's better," he said. "We've got a great view of the house across the road. By the way, it's number 59. "Hold on there for a while," said Preston. "I'm trying to fix something better. Superintendent, we may have to stake out that house for a longer period. That means taking over the front upper room of a house across the road. Can we find anyone in Compton Street who might let us do that?" The police chief was thoughtful. "I do know someone who lives in Compton Street," he said. "We're both Masons, members of the same lodge. He's a former chief petty officer in the Navy, retired now. He's at number 68. Birkinshaw confirmed that number 68 would give perfect observation of the target. Superintendent King rang his friend from the station. At Preston's suggestion, he told the sleepy householder, a Mr. Sam Royston, that this was a police operation. They wished to watch a possible suspect who'd taken refuge across the road. When he'd gathered his wits, Mr. Royston rose to the occasion. As a law-abiding citizen, he would certainly allow the police to use his front room. The van was quietly driven round the block into West Street. Birkinshaw and his team slipped between the houses there, over the garden fences, and entered Mr. Royston's house on Compton Street from the back garden. Just before the summer sun flooded the road, the watcher team settled down in the Roystons' unmade-up bedroom behind the lace curtains, through which they could see number 59 across the street. Mr. Royston, ramrod stiff in camel dressing-gown and bristling with the self-importance of a patriot, asked to assist the Queen's officers, glowered through the curtains at the house almost opposite. "Bank robbers, are they? Drug traffickers?" "Something like that," assented Birkinshaw. "Foreigners," growled Royston. "Never did like 'em. Should never have let 'em all into the country." At the police station, the desk sergeant had established the identity of the two inhabitants of 59 Compton Street. "Two Greek Cypriots, sir," he reported to Superintendent King. "Both bachelors and brothers. Andreas and Spiridon Stefanades. Been here about 4 years, according to the constable on that beat. Seems they run a doner kebab and Greek takeaway at Holywell Cross." Winkler left the house in Compton Street at 9:30 on foot. He went back to the station, took the London train, and was picked up at St. Pancras by a fresh team of watchers. He then went straight to Heathrow and caught the afternoon flight out to Vienna. Irvin's head of station in Vienna later reported that he was met by 2 men from the Soviet embassy. Preston spent the rest of the day closeted in the police station, attending to the wealth of administrative detail involved in a stakeout in the provinces. Photos were taken with a long lens of both Greek brothers as they left Compton Street for their taverna at Holywell Cross. Other experts came in from Manchester, went into the local telephone exchange and put a tap on both the Greeks' phones at the house and the taverna. A direction finder bleeper was slipped into their car. By late afternoon, London had a make on the Greeks. They were not true Cypriots, but they were brothers. Veteran Greek communists once active in the Elas movement, they had left mainland Greece for Cyprus 20 years earlier. Immigration records at Croydon informed that the Stefanades brothers had entered Britain 5 years before as legitimate Cypriot citizens and been permitted to stay. Records in Chesterfield showed they had arrived there just 3.5 years earlier from London, taken a long lease on the kebab house, and bought the small terrace residence in Compton Street. Since then they had lived as peaceful and law-abiding citizens. At his house in Compton Street, Mr. Royston had been urged to continue his normal routine, visiting the shops in the morning and the bowling green in the afternoon. Extra food and drink would be brought in after dark in case neighbours wondered at the Roystons' sudden and vastly increased appetite. A small television was brought in for what Mr. Royston termed the lads upstairs, and they all settled down to wait and watch. When Preston arrived, the 4 watchers seemed to have made themselves quite at home. Barney and Mungo were snoozing, one on the bed and the other on the floor. Ginger was sitting in an easy chair, sipping a cup of fresh brewed tea.
Harry Birkinshaw was sitting like a Buddha in an armchair behind the lace curtains, gazing across at the empty house. "Are you bringing up the covert entry team?" Harry asked. "No," said Preston. "What I'm waiting for is a chummy to show up. When he does, we take the cars and tail him. Len can take over the house." They settled down in companionable silence. Barney woke up.
"Anything on the telly?"
he asked. "Not much," said Ginger. "Evening news, usual rubbish." 24 hours later, on the Thursday evening at the same hour, the news was quite interesting. On their small screen they saw the Prime Minister standing on the steps of No. 10 Downing Street in a neat blue suit, facing a horde of press and television crews. She announced she had returned from Buckingham Palace, where she had asked for a dissolution of Parliament. In consequence, the country would prepare for a general election to be held on the 18th of June next. The 5th of June found Major Petrovsky shopping in Ipswich town centre. From a hardware store he bought a light, short-handled, two-wheeled trolley of the type used for shifting heavy suitcases. A builder's merchant yielded 2 10-foot planks. In an office equipment shop he acquired a small steel filing cabinet. A timber store provided a variety of lathes, battens, and short joists, while a do-it-yourself shop sold him a complete toolbox including a high-speed drill, plus nails, bolts, nuts, screws, and a pair of heavy-duty industrial gloves. He rounded off the morning in an electrical emporium with the purchase of 4 cubic 9-volt batteries and a selection of multicolored single-flex wiring. It took 2 journeys in his hatchback saloon car to bring the loads back to Cherry Hayes Close, where he stored them in a garage. After dark, he brought most of the gear inside the house. That night, the radio told him in Morse the details of the arrival of the assembler. It would be Rendezvous X, and the date Monday the 8th. Tight, he thought. Damn tight. But he would still be on target. While Petrovsky was crouched over his one-time pad deciphering the message, and the Greeks were serving moussaka and kebab to the queue of people who just quit the nearby bars at closing time, Preston was in the police station on the phone to Sir Bernard Hemmings.
"The question is, John, how long can we keep going up there in Chesterfield without any results?"
said Sir Bernard. "It's only been a week, sir," said Preston. "Stakeouts have lasted a lot longer."
"Oh, yes, I well know that. The thing is, we usually have more to go on. There's a growing move here that advocates crashing in on the Greeks. Why won't you agree a clandestine entry while they're at work?"
"Because I think they're top pros and they'd spot that they'd been done over. If that happened, they probably have a foolproof way of warning off their controller from ever visiting them again."
"Yes, I suppose you're right. It's all very well you sitting over that house like a tethered goat in India waiting for the tiger to come. But supposing the tiger doesn't show?"
"I believe he will, sooner or later, Sir Bernard," said Preston. "Please, give me a bit more time."
"All right,"
conceded Hemmings after a pause for consultation at the other end.
"A week, John. Next Friday I'll have to jack up the special branch lads to go in there and take the place apart."
The Finnair jet from Helsinki arrived the following Monday afternoon, on time, as usual, and its complement of passengers passed through Heathrow without undue problems. One of them was a tall, bearded man of middle age with a Finnish passport. He was, in fact, a Russian, called Vassiliev, and by profession a scientist in nuclear engineering. Having cleared customs, he took the airport courtesy coach to the Heathrow Penta Hotel, walked in through the front, kept going right past reception, and emerged at the rear door, giving on to the car park. He waited by that door until a small hatchback saloon drew abreast of him. The driver had his window open. "Is this where the coaches from the airport drop the passengers?" he asked. "No," said the traveller. "I think that is round the front." "Where are you from?" asked the young man. "Finland, actually," said the bearded one. The young man nodded. Vassiliev walked around the car and climbed in. They drove off. "Name?" asked Petrovsky.
"Vassiliev."
"That'll do. Nothing more. I'm Ross."
"Far to go?"
asked Vassiliev. "About 2 hours." Inside the sitting room, Petrovsky closed the curtains as he always did before putting on the light. Vassiliev stood motionless in the gloom. "Right," he said when the lights went on. "To business. Have you got all the 9 consignments that were sent to you?" "Yes," said Petrovsky. "Well, that's it then. If you've got the rest of the innocent commercial purchases, I'll start assembling in the morning." "Why not now?" "Look, young man, first, the sawing and drilling is hardly going to please the neighbors at this hour. Secondly, I'm tired. With this kind of toy you don't make mistakes. I'll start fresh tomorrow and be finished by sundown." Petrovsky nodded. "Take the back bedroom. I'll run you to Heathrow on Wednesday in time for the morning flight." By 6 p.m. Vasiliev had completed his work. "So, Comrade Ross, there it is. You can wheel it on the trolley into the rear of the hatchback, and it will not damage it. You can drive where you wish. The vibration will not disturb it. One last thing. The yellow button here will, if pushed firmly, start the timer, but not complete the electrical circuit. The timer will do that 2 hours later. Press this yellow one, and you have 2 hours to get the hell out. The red one is a manual override. Press that, and you get instant detonation." He did not know he was wrong. He really believed what he'd been told. Only 4 men in Moscow knew both buttons were set for instant detonation. They set off for Heathrow at 10 in Petrovsky's small car. At a lay-by southwest of Colchester, where the dense woods came close to the road, Petrovsky got out to relieve himself. Seconds later, Vasiliev heard his sharp cries of alarm and ran to investigate. He ended his life with an expertly broken neck behind a screen of trees. The body, stripped of all identification, was laid in a shallow ditch and covered with fresh branches. Petrovsky drove back to Ipswich. Everything was ready, but time was short. He had visited Rendlesham Forest and picked his spot. In dense cover, but hardly 100 yards from the perimeter wire of USAF base Bentwaters. There would be no one there at 4 in the morning when he pressed the yellow button to initiate detonation at 6. The only thing he did not know was which morning. The signal to go operational would, he knew, come on the Radio Moscow English Language Service News at 10 p.m. the previous evening. It would be in the form of a deliberate word fluff by the newsreader in the first news item. But Moscow still had to be informed that all was in place. It meant the last message by radio. After that, the Greeks would be dispensable. In the dusk of a warm June evening, he left Cherry Haze Close and drove sedately north towards Thetford and his motorcycle. At 9, he began to ride northwest into the British Midlands. Preston's Tiger came just before the hour of midnight. The street was very quiet. Preston had scattered his 4 cars and their crews far and wide, and nobody saw him come. The first they knew, there was a mutter from one of Stewart's men. "There's a man at the top end of Compton Street, junction of Cross Street." "Doing?" asked Preston. "Nothing. Standing motionless in the shadows." "Wait." Mungo crouched behind the camera, which was wearing its infrared lens. Preston held his small radio close to one ear. "He's moving," the radio muttered. "Down towards you." "Got him," hissed Ginger. "Medium height and build, dark long raincoat." "Mungo, can you get him under that street light just before the Greek's house?" asked Birkinshaw. Without a sound, the figure in the raincoat entered the glimmer cast by the street lamp. Mungo's camera threw off 5 fast exposures. The man passed out of the light and arrived at the gate of the Stefanidis house. He went up the short path and tapped, instead of ringing, at the door. It opened at once. There was no light in the hall. The dark raincoat passed inside. The door closed. "Mungo, get that film out of there and over to the police lab. I want it developed and passed straight to Scotland Yard. Immediate on-pass to Charles and Sentinel. I'll tell them to be ready to try and get a make." Something was bothering Preston. Something about the way the man walked. "Mungo, what was he wearing? We saw him in close-up." Mungo was halfway out the door. "A raincoat," he said. "Dark, long. Underneath that." Ginger whistled. "Boots. Remember 'em now. 10 inches of jackboot." "Shit, he's on a motorcycle," said Preston. He spoke into the radio. "Everyone out on the streets, on foot only. Every street in the district except Compton Street were looking for a motorcycle with a warm engine block. The problem is, he thought, I don't know how long he's going to be in there. He called up Len Stewart. Len, John here. If we get that motorcycle, I want a DF bleeper in it somewhere. Meanwhile, call up Superintendent King. When Chummy leaves, we'll be after him. Harry's team and me. I want you to stay with your boys on the Greeks. When we are all 1 hour clear, the police can take the house and the Greeks. Len Stewart inside the police station assented and started to phone Superintendent King at home. It was 20 minutes before one of the roving team found the motorcycle. He reported to Preston, still at the Royston house. There's a big BMW top end of Queen Street, carrier box behind the pillion, locked. 2 panniers either side of the rear wheel, unlocked. Engine and exhaust still warm. The man who'd found the motorcycle was ordered to plant the bleeper in one of the panniers, switch it on and get well away from the vehicle. "Okay," said Preston. "We're doing a changeover. All drivers back to their cars, one by one, quietly, and now." Stewart's men in the Royston house reported the man in the raincoat had left the door across the street. They confirmed he walked up Compton Street towards Cross Street and in the direction of the BMW. Then he passed out of sight. 5 minutes went by. Preston prayed. "He's moving." The flashing blip was slowly cruising across the screen as the motorcycle changed the angle between itself and the car. "Target on the move," the second car confirmed. "Give him a mile, then take off," said Preston. "Start engines now." The blip moved south and east through the centre of Chesterfield. When it was close to the Lord's Mill roundabout, the cars began to follow. When they reached the roundabout, there was no doubt. The signal from the motorcycle was steady and strong, straight down the A617 to Mansfield and Newark. Range just over a mile. Even their lights would be out of sight of the motorcyclist ahead. Joe grinned. "Try and shake us now, you bastard," he remarked. After Newark, the countryside flattened and the wind increased. The pursuit entered the gently rolling wolds of Lincolnshire and the arrow-straight roads that led into the fen country. The flashing blip was steady and strong, leading Preston's 2 cars down the A17 past Sleaford towards the Wash and the county of Norfolk. They almost lost him 6 miles south of King's Lynn. Preston consulted his road map. "He's turned off back there on the A134, he said, "heading for Thetford. Take a left here." They got on the tail again at Stratsit, and then it was a straight run to Thetford. They had reached the top of Gallows Hill and could see the ancient market town spread out ahead of them in the dim light of dawn when Joe slewed to a halt. He stopped again. "Where is he?" Joe studied the range indicator and pointed ahead. "Right in the heart of the town, John." Preston yawned. "We'll give him 10. The blip never moved for 10 minutes, nor another 5. Preston sent his second car round the ring road. From 4 points the second car triangulated with the first. The blip was right in the centre of Thetford. Preston picked up the hand mag. "Okay, I think we have his base. We're moving in." The 2 cars converged on Magdalen Street and at 5:25 found the hollow square of lock-up garages. "He's in there," said Joe. Preston climbed out. He was joined by Barney and Ginger from the other car. "Ginger, can you lose that door handle?" For answer, Ginger took a spark plug spanner from the toolkit in one of the cars, slipped it over the garage door handle and jerked it sharply. There was a crack inside the lock. He swept the up-and-over garage door open and stood hastily back. The men in the yard just stared. The motorcycle occupied the centre of the garage on its stand. From a hook hung a set of black leathers and a crash helmet. A pair of jackboots stood near the wall. In the dust and oil on the floor were the tracks of a pair of small motor-car tires. "Oh, Jesus," said Harry Birkinshaw. "It's a switch-over." Joe leaned out of his window. "Cork just came on the police network. They say they've a full-face picture. Where do you want it sent?" "Thetford Police Station," said Preston. "But it's too late." By 5:15, Valery Petrovsky was clear of Thetford and, as usual, was motoring sedately south down the A1088 to pick up the main road to Ipswich and home. He crossed the border into Suffolk near Euston Hall and noted a police motorcyclist stationary by the side of the road astride his machine. It was the wrong road and the wrong hour. He'd motored this road many times over the previous months, and he'd never seen a police patrolman on it. Suddenly all his animal senses went to full alert. 2 white Rover police cars were parked on the side of the road. Beside them a group of senior officers were in consultation with 2 more motorcycle patrolmen. They glanced up at him as he drove by, but made no move to stop him. The move came later at Ixworth Thorpe. He'd just cleared the village itself and was approaching its church when he saw the police motorcycle leaning against the hedge and the figure of the patrolman in the centre of the road, arm raised to stop him. He began to slow, his right hand dropping to the map pocket inside the door panel where lay the Finnish automatic. He slowed to a halt. Petrovsky found himself confronting a ruddy Suffolk face with no hint of guile in it. "Could I ask you to pull over to the side of the road, please, sir? Just there in front of the church. You'll come to no harm." "What seems to be the trouble, officer?" "Afraid the road's blocked a bit further down, sir. We'll have it cleared directly." He nodded, let in the clutch, and pulled the car into the lay-by in front of the church. Then he waited. In his mirror he could see the policeman signalling another saloon into the same lay-by. This could be it, he thought, counterintelligence. But there was only one man in the other car. It stopped behind him. The man climbed out. "What's going on?" he called to the policeman. "Ain't you heard, sir? It's a demonstration. The unilateral lot. Been in all the papers and the telly." "Oh, hell," said the other driver. "I didn't realize it was this road or at this hour." "They won't take long to pass," said the policeman comfortingly. "No more than an hour." At that moment the head of the column came into sight round the bend. Petrovsky gazed at the banners in the distance and heard the faint shouts with disgust and contempt. He climbed out to watch. Preston had called up London on the police network. He threw caution to the winds and spoke in clear to Sir Bernard himself. "I need backup from the police forces of Norfolk and Suffolk," he said. "Also a chopper, sir, very fast, or it's all over." He'd spent the waiting 20 minutes studying the large-scale road map of East Anglia spread on the bonnet of Joe's car. Barney arrived back from the police station. "Here's the photograph, John. Came through while I was talking to the DS." Preston studied the handsome young face. "You bastard," he muttered. His words were drowned so no one else heard. 2 American F-111 strike bombers raced across the town in tight formation, low, heading east. Preston beckoned the Thetford policeman across to his car. "Point out to me the American air bases round here," he said. The patrolman put a thick finger on the map. "Well, they're a bit all over, sir. There's Sculthorpe up there in North Norfolk, Lakenheath and Milden all over here to the west, then there's Bentwaters here on the Suffolk coast near Woodbridge." It was 6 o'clock. The marchers swirled round the parked cars on the lay-by in front of the Church of All Saints. Petrovsky stood by his car watching them amble by, arms crossed, his face bland. His private thoughts were venomous. If he'd had a more developed sense of humour, he might have smiled at this situation. He was standing in front of the church of a God in whom he did not believe, in a country he was seeking to destroy, giving passage to people he heartily despised. And yet, if his mission was successful, all the marchers' demands would be fulfilled. The helicopter lifted off and climbed away from Thetford. "Where do you want to go?" "Down the A1088, said Preston. "Want to see the demo, eh?" "What demo?" The pilot looked at him as if he'd just arrived from Mars. The chopper nosed down whirled southeast with the line of the A1088 to starboard so that Preston could see it. "The RAF Honington demo," pilot said. "Been in all the papers and on TV." Away to his right, the morning sun glinted on the runways of the airbase. Outside the base's several gates were the black lines of Suffolk policemen, hundreds of them, standing back to the wire facing the demonstrators. The marchers were at their thickest as they swirled round the entrance to the narrow lane leading to the base. His heart gave a thump. Up the road from Honington village centre there was a line of cars tailing back for half a mile. "I wonder," he whispered. He picked up the radio. "Harry, can you hear me?" "Come in, Harry, it's John." Preston was sitting in the doorway of the chopper over Ixworth Thorpe trying to raise Birkinshaw. The watcher's voice came back, scratchy and tinny, from Thetford. "Harry here. Read you, John." "Harry, there's an anti-cruise demo going on down there. There's a chance, just a chance, that Chummy got caught up in it. Harry, meet me at the junction of the A1088 and the 45 at Elmswell. Use the copper up at the garages as an outrider, and Harry, tell Joe to drive like never in his life." He tapped the pilot on the shoulder. "Take me down there. Set me down in a field near the road junction." At the junction, Preston watched the unending stream of traffic crawling through the roadblock, examining as casually as possible the frustrated faces of the drivers. Major Valery Petrovsky was in the 17th car. Eyes half closed, the memory of the photo in his pocket imprinted on his mind, Preston looked across at the Russian 12 feet away as the saloon slowly passed through. He saw the little saloon turn left into the A45, pause for a break in the traffic, and pull into the Ipswich-bound stream. Then he was up and running. The industrial and commuter traffic into Ipswich was dense, and became thicker as they approached the town. It provided good cover for the two watcher cars, who constantly shifted positions so that they could alternately keep the Ford hatchback in view. Quite suddenly the hatchback pulled to the left and entered a small private housing estate. "Steady," Preston warned Joe. "He mustn't see us now." He told the second car to stay at the junction of the access road and Belstead, in case the quarry came round in a circle and back out again. Joe cruised slowly into the complex of 7 cul-de-sacs that make up the Haze. They went past the entrance to Cherry Haze Close just in time to see the man they were tailing parked on a hard pad in front of a small house halfway up the close. The man was climbing out of his car. Preston ordered Joe to keep going until out of sight and stop. 10 minutes later, Preston rang Charles Street and was put through to Sir Bernard Hemmings.
"Preston,"
said the Director-General down the line.
"John, where are you exactly?"
"A small residential cul-de-sac called Cherry Haze Close in Ipswich," said Preston. "We've run Chummy to earth. I'm certain this time it's his base."
"Do you think it's time we moved in?"
"Yes, sir, I do. I fear he may be armed. I think you know what I mean. I don't think it's one for the special branch or the local force." He told his DG what he wanted, then replaced the receiver and put in a private call to Sir Nigel in Sentinel House.
"Yes, John, I agree,"
said C, when he'd been given the same information.
"If he's got within what we think, it had better be as you ask. The SAS."
Captain Lyndhurst had a last word with each man, and the longest with his number 2, Steve Bilbo. There was, of course, no mention of good luck. Anything else but never good luck. Then the commander left for the observation post. At 9:43 the grey van entered the close called Gorse Haze, the access road to the whole complex. Standing in the hall by the telephone, Preston could hear the chit-chat between the van driver and Lyndhurst. The van was cruising slowly and quietly towards the entrance to Cherry Haze. There was still no pedestrian on the road. Lyndhurst ordered the 2 rear garden men to quit their police car and start moving. "Entering Cherry Haze, 15 seconds, muttered the van's co-driver. "Slow down, 30 seconds to go," replied Lyndhurst. 20 seconds later he said, "Enter the close, now." Round the corner came the van, quite slowly, on sidelights. 8 seconds, murmured Lyndhurst into the receiver. Then a savage whisper to Preston, "Dial now." The van cruised up the close, passed the door of number 12, and stopped. It was deliberate. The assaulters wanted to approach the stronghold slantwise. The oiled side door slid back, and into the gloom 4 men in black stepped in complete silence. There was no running, no pounding of feet or hoarse cries. In rehearsed order they walked calmly across Mr. Armitage's lawn, round the parked hatchback of Mr. Ross, and up to the front door of number 12. The man with the wingmaster knew which side the hinges would be. Before he'd finished walking, his gun was at his shoulder. He made out the hinge positions and took careful aim. Beside him another figure waited with a sledgehammer swung back. Behind them were Steve and the corporal, HKs ready. In his sitting room, Major Valery Petrovsky was unquiet. He could not concentrate on the television. His senses picked up too much. The clatter of a man putting out milk bottles, the meow of a cat, the snarl of a motorcycle engine far away, the hoot of a freighter entering the estuary of the Orwell across the valley. 9:30 had produced another current affairs program, with yet more interviews with ministers and hopeful ministers-to-be. In exasperation, he flicked over to BBC Two, only to find a documentary about birds. He sighed. It was better than politics. Something on the television caught his eye. The interviewer was talking to a lanky man in a flat cap about his passion, which appeared to be pigeons. He was holding one up in front of the camera, a sleek creature with a distinctive cast to its beak and head. At that moment, the telephone in Petrovsky's hallway rang. Normally, he would have gone to answer it, in case it was a neighbour. To pretend to be out would have been suspicious, with the house lights on, and he would not have taken his handgun to the hall. But he stayed and stared at the screen. The phone rang on insistently. With the television, it drowned the soft pad of rubber-soled feet on the pavement. Petrovsky came out of his chair with a snarl of rage. The big, precision-made Seiko target pistol that he kept close to him since he'd entered Britain came up with him from its place down the side of the seat cushion. At that moment there was a roar, then another. With them came the shatter of glass from his front door, two huge bangs from the rear of the house, and the thud of feet in the hall. Petrovsky spun towards the sitting-room and fired 3 times. The citizens of Cherry Hayes Close will describe that night for the rest of their lives, but none will ever get it quite right. When the shotgun fired, Captain Lyndhurst opened the front door across the road and watched. Preston behind him. In the lighted hallway, the captain saw his deputy commander approach the sitting-room door, only to be thrown aside like a rag doll. Lyndhurst started to walk forward, Preston behind him. As the trooper who had fired the 2 bursts came to his feet and surveyed the inert figure on the carpet, Captain Lyndhurst appeared in the doorway. "Go and help Steve in the hall," he said crisply. The trooper did not argue. The man on the floor began to move. Lyndhurst drew his Browning from beneath his jacket. The trooper had been good. Petrovsky had taken 1 slug in the left knee, 1 in the lower stomach, and 1 in the right shoulder. His pistol had been flung across the room. Petrovsky was in hideous pain, but he was alive. He began to crawl. 12 feet away he could see the grey steel, the flat box on its side, the 2 buttons, 1 yellow and 1 red. Captain Lyndhurst took careful aim and fired once. John Preston ran past him so fast he jostled the officer's hip as he ran. He went on his knees beside the body on the floor. It was on its side, half the back of the head blown away, the mouth still working like a fish on a slab. Preston bent his head to the dying face. Lyndhurst still had his gun at the aim, but the MI5 man was between him and the Russian. He stepped to one side to get a clearer shot, then lowered the Browning. Preston was rising. There was no need for a second shot. "We'd better get the Wallace from Aldermaston and have a look at that," said Lyndhurst, gesturing at the steel cabinet in the corner. "I wanted him alive," said Preston. "Sorry, old boy, couldn't be done," said the captain. At that moment both men jumped at the sound of a loud click, and a voice speaking to them from the sideboard. They saw the sound come from a large radio set which had switched itself on with a timer device. The voice said, "Good evening. This is Radio Moscow, the English language service, and here is the 10 o'clock news. I'm sorry, I'll say that again. In Tehran today, the government stated..." Captain Lyndhurst stepped over and switched the machine off. The man on the floor stared at the moquette carpet with sightless eyes, immune to the coded message meant for him alone. The lunch invitation was for 1 o'clock on Friday the 19th of June at Brooks Club in St. James. Sir Nigel had a corner table where they could talk in privacy.
"I really asked you here, John," said Sir Nigel, "to offer you my thanks and congratulations. A remarkable operation and an excellent result."
"As to the congratulations, sir, I fear I can hardly accept them," said Preston quietly. Sir Nigel studied the menu through his half-moon glasses.
"Indeed. Are you being admirably modest, or not so admirably discourteous?"
Simply realistic, I hope, said Preston. Might we discuss the man we knew as Franz Winkler?
Whom you so brilliantly tailed to Chesterfield.
Permit me to be frank, Sir Nigel. Winkler could not have shaken off a headache with a box of aspirins. He was an incompetent and a fool.
I believe he almost lost you all at Chesterfield railway station.
A fluke, said Preston. Franz Winkler came into Heathrow with a genuine Austrian passport containing a valid British visa.
So he did, to be sure.
And we both know, as did the immigration officer, that Austrian citizens do not need a visa to enter Britain. It was the visa that prompted the passport control officer at Heathrow to run the passport number through the computer, and it turned out to be false.
Well, we all make mistakes,
murmured Sir Nigel. The KGB doesn't make that kind of mistake, sir. Franz Winkler came into this country lit up like a neon sign, and the sign was a message on 2 legs. Sir Nigel's face was still wreathed in good humour, but some of the twinkle had faded from his eyes.
And what did this remarkable message say, John?
I think it said, I cannot give you the executive illegal agent because I do not know where he is, but follow this man. He will lead you to the transmitter. And he did. So I staked out the transmitter, and the agent came to it at last.
What exactly are you trying to say?
I believe, sir, that the operation was blown. It seems to me unavoidable to conclude that someone on the other side deliberately blew it away.
What an extraordinary suggestion. Let me recommend the strawberry flan. Had some last week. Different batch, of course. Yes, 2, my dear, if you please. Yes, a little fresh cream.
May I ask a question? Said Preston, when the plates had been cleared.
Well, I'm sure you will anyway,
smiled Sir Nigel. Why did the Russian have to die?
As I understand, he was crawling towards a nuclear bomb with every apparent intention of detonating it.
I was there, said Preston as the strawberry flan arrived. They waited until the cream had been poured. The man was wounded in the thigh, stomach, and shoulder. Captain Lyndhurst could have stopped him with a kick. There was no need to blow his head off.
Well, I'm sure the good captain wished to make absolutely sure, suggested the master.
Just one more detail, Sir Nigel. Before he died, that Russian whispered one word. He seemed very determined to get that single word out before he went. I had my ear close to his mouth at the time. What he said was, Philby.
Philby? Good heavens! I wonder what he could have meant by that.
I think I know. I think he thought Harold Philby had betrayed him, and I believe he was right.
I see. And may I be privileged to know of your deductions?
The chief's voice was soft, but his tone was devoid of all his earlier bonhomie. Preston took a deep breath. I deduced that Philby, the traitor, was a party to this operation, possibly from the outset. I have heard it whispered that he wants to return home, here to England, to spend his last days. If the plan had worked, he could probably have earned his release from his Soviet masters and his entry from a hard-left government in London, perhaps a year from now, or he could tell London the general outline of the plan, then betray it.
And which of these 2 remarkable choices do you suspect he made?
The second one, Sir Nigel.
To what end, pray?
To buy his ticket home. From this end. A trade. Sir Nigel gazed at the ceiling for a long time before letting out a profound sigh.
You were quite right. The operation was mounted personally by the General Secretary with the advice and assistance of Philby. It seems it was called Plan Aurora. It was betrayed, but not by Philby.
Why was it blown away? Sir Nigel thought for several minutes.
The more I looked at it, the more I became convinced that Plan Aurora was not a true KGB operation. It had not the hallmarks, the painstaking care. It looked like a hasty operation mounted by a man or a group who distrusted the KGB, yet there was little hope of your finding the agent in time.
I was floundering in the dark, Sir Nigel, and I knew it. Without Winkler, I'd never have got to Ipswich in time.
So, I sent a message to Moscow,
said Sir Nigel eventually. From yourself?
Good Lord, no. That would never have done. Much too obvious. I used Berenson and Marias to pass on a message to the KGB that we'd uncovered a Soviet plot to import and detonate a small atomic device inside Britain, and that we were closing in on the Russian infiltrator. Through another source, one I hoped would be believed. It was not a very truthful message, I'm afraid. Sometimes one must tell untruths in our business, but it went through a channel I hoped would be believed.
And it was?
Thankfully, yes. When Winkler arrived, I was sure the message had been received, understood, and, above all, believed as true.
Winkler was the reply? Asked Preston.
Yes, poor man. He believed he was on a routine mission to check on the Greeks and their transmitter. By the by, he was found drowned in Prague 2 weeks ago. Knew too much, I suppose.
And the Russian in Ipswich?
His name, I have just learned, was Petrovsky. First-class professional and a patriot.
But he, too, had to die.
John, it was a terrible decision, but unavoidable. The arrival of Winkler was an offer, a proposal for a trade-off. No formal agreement, of course, just a tacit understanding. The man Petrovsky could not be taken alive and interrogated. I had to go along with the unwritten and unspoken trade with my opposite number in Moscow.
If we had got Petrovsky alive, we'd have had the Soviet Union over a barrel.
Yes, John, indeed we would. We could have subjected them to a huge international humiliation. And to what end? The USSR could not have taken it lying down. They'd have had to reply, somewhere else in the world. What would you have wished? A return to the worst aspects of the Cold War? The USSR is going to be there tomorrow, and next week, and next year. Better they be ruled by pragmatic and realistic men than hotheads and zealots. Somehow, John, we have to share this planet with them.